On a Wyoming frontier ranch, a mail-order bride who has been told all her life she's too ugly to love faces her wedding night, terrified that her new husband will send her back into the darkness she barely escaped. If you're drawn to stories of quiet courage, unexpected grace, and love that speaks louder than words, stay with me until the very end. And please, hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far Maylene's story travels across the world. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the weathered ranch house just as the sun began its descent behind the Medicine Bow Mountains, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of amber and blood. Maylene Chen sat frozen on the wooden bench, her fingers clutching the worn carpet bag that contained everything she owned in this world: 3 threadbare dresses, a jade pendant her mother had pressed into her palm the day she left Canton, and a single daguerreotype of the man who had paid her passage across an ocean and half a continent. "End of the line, miss," the driver called down, his voice neither kind nor unkind, simply matter-of-fact in the way of men who had seen countless mail-order brides delivered like parcels to remote corners of the frontier. Maylene's throat constricted. Through the small window, she could see him, Caleb Ridge, standing on the porch of the log house, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the fading light. He wore a clean shirt, she noticed. He had made an effort. The thought brought no comfort, only a sharper edge to her fear. The driver opened the door, and the evening air rushed in, carrying the scent of sage and dust and something else she couldn't name, the smell of a land so vast and empty it seemed to swallow sound itself. She stepped down on trembling legs, and the earth beneath her feet felt foreign, harder than the soil she had known in her childhood, before the famine, before her parents had died, before her uncle had made it clear that an unmarried woman with a face like hers was nothing but a burden. "You're sure this is the place you want?" the driver asked, and there was something in his tone that made her skin prickle. Pity, perhaps. Or warning. "Yes," she whispered, though the word tasted like ash. Caleb descended the porch steps, each boot fall deliberate and heavy. He was taller than she had imagined, broader, his face weathered by sun and wind into the texture of old leather. His eyes, a pale gray that reminded her of winter skies, swept over her once, taking in her slight frame, her worn traveling dress, the way she held herself as if trying to disappear into the very air. "Maylene Chen?" His voice was low, roughened by disuse, as if words were a currency he rarely spent. "Yes." She bowed her head, the habit of deference carved so deep into her bones that she couldn't have stopped herself if she tried. I am she." The driver handed down her bag and a small trunk that had been strapped to the back of the coach. Caleb accepted them without comment, his movements economical, efficient. He paid the driver, and she watched the exchange of coins with a strange detachment, as if observing a transaction that had nothing to do with her, though she knew with terrible certainty that it had everything to do with her. The stagecoach pulled away, wheels grinding against the hard-packed earth, and then there was only silence. The kind of silence she had never known in Canton, where even at night the city hummed with human noise. Here, the quiet was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through the grass and the distant cry of a hawk circling in the darkening sky. "It's getting cold," Caleb said. "Best get inside." He turned and walked toward the house, carrying her trunk as if it weighed nothing. Maylene followed, her steps small and uncertain, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The porch boards creaked under her weight, and she flinched at the sound, at the way it announced her presence, her intrusion into this man's solitary world. Inside, the house was spare but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a low fire already burning, casting dancing shadows across rough-hewn furniture. A table, 2 chairs, a sideboard with a few tin plates and cups. The floor was swept, the windows recently washed. Someone had hung curtains, simple calico that stirred in the draft from the door. "Your room's there," Caleb said, nodding toward a doorway on the left. "I'll sleep in the barn tonight. Give you time to settle." The words hung in the air between them, and Maylene felt something inside her chest crack open. The barn. He would sleep in the barn on their wedding night because he couldn't bear to be near her. She had known this would happen, had steeled herself for it during the long journey west, but the reality of it was somehow worse than all her imaginings. Her voice faltered. She forced herself to look up, to meet his eyes, though everything in her screamed to keep her gaze fixed on the floor. I understand. Something flickered across his face, too quick to read. Do you? Yes. The word came out barely louder than a breath. I know I am not. I know what I am. And what's that? The question caught her off guard. She had expected dismissal, perhaps disgust carefully veiled behind frontier stoicism. She had not expected him to ask her to name her own unworthiness aloud. I am ugly, she said, and the words tasted familiar, worn smooth by years of repetition. I am not the wife you hoped for. I am grateful you paid my passage, grateful you married me when you could have refused after seeing my photograph. I will work hard. I will not complain. I will not ask for anything beyond food and shelter, and I will not expect you to. She couldn't finish. The heat of shame crawled up her neck, flooded her cheeks. In the firelight, she knew her skin looked sallow, her features too sharp, too foreign. The matchmaker had warned her that frontier men preferred soft, pretty women, women who looked like the girls in the illustrated papers from back east, women nothing like her. Caleb was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone very quiet. Who told you that? Told me what? That you're ugly. Maylene's breath caught. Everyone. My uncle said I had a face like a dried apricot, that no man would want me unless he was desperate or drunk. The matchmaker said I should be grateful anyone would take me, even a widower alone on the frontier. The women on the ship from San Francisco. She stopped, swallowing hard against the memory of their whispers, their pointed looks, their pity that felt sharper than contempt. I see. Caleb set her trunk down by the bedroom door. You've been carrying that a long time. It wasn't a question. Maylene nodded, not trusting her voice. The Reverend who married us, Caleb said. He's coming back tomorrow to make it official with witnesses. We stood before him this afternoon because the stagecoach schedule didn't leave time for anything else, but the law requires 2 witnesses for it to count. I asked him to return with his wife and the postmaster. If you want to leave before then, if you want to take the next stage back to San Francisco or wherever you came from, I'll pay your fare. No one will force you to stay in a place you don't want to be. The offer should have been a kindness. Instead, it felt like a door closing, like the final confirmation of every terrible thing she had believed about herself. Of course he wanted her gone. Of course he was already planning her departure. I have nowhere to go, she said, and hated the weakness in her voice. No money, no family. If you send me back, I will end up. She couldn't say it, couldn't speak aloud the fate that awaited unwanted women in cities crowded with desperate immigrants. Please, I will be useful. I can cook, clean, mend, tend a garden. I will earn my keep. That's not what I asked. Then what did you ask? Whether you want to stay. The question was so unexpected that for a moment Maylene forgot to breathe. Want. When had anyone ever asked her what she wanted? Her uncle had wanted her gone. The matchmaker had wanted her commission. The other mail-order brides on the ship had wanted her to stop crying at night, stop reminding them of their own fears. But what did she want? I want... The words stuck in her throat, foreign and frightening. I want to stay. If you'll let me. Caleb nodded slowly. Then you'll stay. He moved toward the door, then paused, his hand on the frame. I meant what I said about the barn. You need space to breathe. Figure out if this is something you can live with. I'll be back in the morning. Wait. The word escaped before she could stop it. He turned back, one eyebrow raised. Why? Maylene asked. Why did you send for me? The matchmaker said you're a widower, said your wife died 2 years ago. You could have found someone else, someone prettier, younger. Why would you choose? She gestured at herself, a small, helpless motion that encompassed all her inadequacy. For the first time, something that might have been a smile touched the corner of Caleb's mouth, though it was gone too quickly to be sure. I didn't choose you because of how you look, Maylene Chen. I chose you because of what you wrote. What I wrote? In your letter, you said you weren't looking for romance or sweet words. You said you wanted honest work and a place to belong. You said you'd been alone long enough to know the difference between loneliness and solitude. He paused. That told me more than any photograph could. Before she could respond, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Maylene stood in the center of the room, her hand still clutching her carpet bag, her mind reeling. She had written that letter in the back room of the matchmaker's office, hunched over a piece of borrowed paper, her English halting and uncertain. She had tried to be honest because she had nothing else to offer, no beauty or charm or feminine grace to hide behind. And somehow, impossibly, that honesty had been enough. She moved to the window and watched Caleb's tall figure cross the yard toward the barn, his stride long and unhurried. The mountains loomed against the darkening sky, their peaks still touched with the last light of day. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. The sound was lonely and wild and strangely beautiful. Maylene pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Tomorrow, the Reverend would come with his witnesses, and the marriage would be legal, binding. There would be no turning back. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt only a strange, fragile hope, as insubstantial as smoke, but there nonetheless. She turned from the window and began to unpack her trunk, her movements slow and methodical. The bedroom was small but well built, with a real bed frame and a mattress stuffed with fresh straw and wool. Someone, Caleb, she assumed, had hung pegs on the wall for her clothes and left a basin and pitcher of water on a small stand. There was even a mirror, spotted and old, propped against the wall. Maylene avoided her reflection as she always did, focusing instead on the tasks at hand. She hung her dresses, placed her few undergarments in a drawer, set her mother's jade pendant on the small table beside the bed. When everything was in its place, she sat on the edge of the mattress and let herself feel the full weight of the day, the journey, the fear, the strange encounter with the man who was now her husband. The fire in the main room crackled and popped. Maylene rose and went to tend it, adding wood from the stack beside the hearth. The warmth felt good against her skin, chasing away the chill that had settled into her bones during the long stagecoach ride. She noticed a pot hanging on a hook over the fire, steam rising from whatever was cooking inside. She lifted the lid carefully. Venison stew, thick with vegetables and rich with the smell of herbs. He had made dinner. For her. The thought brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She blinked them away angrily. She had not cried when her parents died, had not cried when her uncle turned her out, had not cried during the nightmare weeks in the hold of the steamship crossing the Pacific. She would not cry now over a simple pot of stew. But the tears came anyway, silent and unstoppable, born of exhaustion and relief, and a loneliness so deep it had become part of her bones. She sank into one of the chairs and let herself weep, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs she had held back for years. She didn't hear the door open, didn't hear the soft tread of boots on the wooden floor. She only knew Caleb had returned when his shadow fell across her, and she looked up to find him standing there, a blanket draped over one arm, concern etched into the weathered lines of his face. "I heard—" He stopped, seeming uncertain. "I thought you might need this. Gets cold at night." Maylene wiped her face with the back of her hand, humiliation flooding through her. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I'm not usually—" "You don't need to apologize for crying in your own home." The words were simple, but they struck her like a physical blow. Her own home. When had she ever had that? Not in her uncle's house, where she had been tolerated at best. Not in the boarding house in San Francisco, where she had waited 3 months for Caleb's letter and the train tickets west. But here, in this rough cabin at the edge of nowhere, a stranger was calling it hers. Caleb set the blanket on the back of the chair. "Stew's ready if you're hungry. I'll head back to the barn." "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. She took a breath, tried again. "Please, stay. Eat. This is your home. I'm the intruder here. You're my wife." He said it matter-of-factly, the way he might have said it's Tuesday or rain's coming. A statement of simple truth, in name only. Names matter. He moved to the sideboard and took down 2 bowls, 2 spoons. They make things real. He ladled stew into both bowls and set one before her. The scent made her stomach clench with hunger. She hadn't eaten since early morning, and even then it had been only hard bread and weak tea at a way station. But she waited until he sat down across from her, waited until he picked up his spoon before she allowed herself to taste it. The stew was good, better than good, rich and savory, the meat tender, the vegetables cooked just soft enough. She ate slowly, aware of his eyes on her, though when she glanced up he was focused on his own bowl, his expression unreadable. "It's very good," she said quietly. "Thank you." He nodded but said nothing. They ate in silence, and Mei Lin found herself studying him in quick, furtive glances. He was older than her, perhaps 40, though the frontier aged men quickly, and it was hard to be certain. His hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who worked with them every day. He ate efficiently, without waste or hurry, and when he finished he rose and carried his bowl to the sideboard without a word. "I can wash those," Mei Lin said quickly, standing. "Tomorrow." He glanced toward the window, where full darkness had fallen. "It's late. You should rest." "I'm not tired." It was a lie, but she couldn't bear the thought of being alone yet, shut away in that small room with nothing but her own thoughts for company. Caleb studied her for a moment, then nodded toward the fire. "Suit yourself. But I've got early chores, stock to feed, fences to check. Won't be good company." He settled into the chair by the hearth, his long legs stretched toward the fire, and picked up a piece of leather and a needle from a basket beside the chair. Mei Lin watched as he began to work, his movements practiced and sure, mending a bridle that had seen better days. She took the other chair, the blanket he'd brought wrapped around her shoulders, and let the warmth and the soft sounds of his work wash over her. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes, but inside the cabin felt solid and safe, a haven against the vast darkness of the frontier night. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a while. "You can ask." His hands didn't stop moving. "Your wife, the one who died, did you love her?" The needle paused for just a moment, then resumed its steady rhythm. "I respected her, cared for her. Don't know if that's the same as love." "Why did she come here? To this place?" "Same reason you did, I expect. Nowhere else to go." He knotted off a thread and bit it clean with his teeth. "Her father gambled away everything they had back in Missouri. She answered an advertisement I placed in a newspaper. We wrote letters for 6 months, then she came west." "Was she happy?" "Don't know if happy is the right word. She was content, I think. For a while." He set the bridle aside and looked into the fire. "The winters are hard here. The isolation. Some people can't take it. She got sick the second winter. Fever that wouldn't break. By the time I could get her to a doctor in town, it was too late." "I'm sorry." "That's life on the frontier. You do what you can and hope it's enough." He stood, stretching. "I should let you get some rest. Morning comes early." "Caleb?" She said his name for the first time, tasting it, testing how it felt on her tongue. He paused in the doorway to the main room. "Yes?" "Why the barn? Really?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Because you're scared of me. And I figured you'd be less scared if I gave you space to breathe." The simple honesty of it left her speechless. He didn't wait for a response, just stepped out into the night, closing the door softly behind him. Mei Lin sat alone by the dying fire, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. Through the window she could see the faint glow of a lantern in the barn. She thought about what he'd said, that she was scared of him. It was true, but not in the way he probably meant. She wasn't afraid he would hurt her. She was afraid he would be kind, would make her hope, would make her believe she could have something more than survival. And then, when he inevitably realized his mistake, when he saw her clearly in the harsh light of day and understood what he had tied himself to, the loss would be unbearable. Better not to hope at all. She rose and banked the fire, then made her way to the small bedroom. The bed was softer than anything she'd slept on in years, the quilts clean and smelling faintly of lavender. She undressed slowly, her fingers clumsy with exhaustion, and slipped between the sheets in her chemise. Sleep should have come easily. Instead, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams barely visible in the darkness, listening to the wind and the small sounds of the house settling around her. Tomorrow the Reverend would come, and the marriage would be legal. Tomorrow she would have to begin learning what it meant to be Caleb Ridge's wife, not just in name, but in practice. Tomorrow she would have to begin building a life in this strange, wild place. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was warm and fed and safe. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was enough. The dawn came gray and cold, creeping through the curtains with hesitant light. Maylene woke to the sound of movement in the main room, the scrape of the stove door, the clank of metal on metal, the soft tread of boots on wooden floor. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was, and panic clawed at her throat. Then memory returned, the stagecoach, the cabin, Caleb, her husband. She rose quickly, splashing cold water from the pitcher onto her face, pulling on her plainest dress, dark blue calico, worn but clean. Her hands trembled as she tried to pin up her hair, and she gave up after the third attempt, settling for a simple braid down her back. In the spotted mirror, her reflection looked small and frightened, her eyes too large in her thin face. "Stop it," she whispered to herself. "Stop looking. It changes nothing." When she emerged from the bedroom, Caleb was at the stove, frying eggs and salt pork in a cast-iron skillet. He glanced up as she entered, his expression neutral. "Morning. Coffee's hot." "Thank you." She moved to the sideboard, found a cup, poured coffee from the pot warming on the back of the stove. The first sip was strong enough to make her eyes water, but the warmth was welcome. "Can I help?" "You can set the table if you want." She did, placing plates and forks and knives with careful precision, as if the exact placement of utensils could somehow prove her worth. When the food was ready, Caleb divided it between the plates without ceremony. 2 eggs each, 3 strips of pork, a slice of bread fried in the drippings. It was more food than she usually ate for breakfast, and she wondered if he always ate this much, or if he was trying to fatten her up, the way her uncle used to fatten the chickens before slaughter. The thought was uncharitable, and she pushed it away. They ate in silence, and Maylene found herself hyper-aware of every sound she made. The scrape of her fork, the click of her teeth on the tin cup. Caleb seemed unbothered by the quiet, eating steadily, his attention focused on his plate. When they finished, he carried his dishes to the dry sink. Reverend Hartley should be here around noon with his wife and Tom Brennan from the post office. They'll witness the marriage certificate, make it legal. I understand. After that, he paused, seemed to choose his words carefully. After that, you'll be Malin Ridge in the eyes of the law, if that's still what you want. It is. Her voice was steady, though her heart hammered. He nodded. Then I'd best get the chores done before they arrive. You can do what you like. Rest, look around, whatever suits you. He hesitated. There's a garden plot behind the house. Sarah, my first wife. She kept it up the first year. If you wanted to put in vegetables come spring, the tools are in the shed. I would like that. Good. He took his hat from a peg by the door. I'll be in the barn if you need anything. And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the cabin with the dirty dishes and the morning light slanting through the windows. Maylene stood in the center of the room, unsure what to do with herself, with this unexpected freedom. In her uncle's house, there had always been tasks, endless tasks that kept her hands busy and her mind numb. Here, in this quiet cabin, the silence pressed in on her like a physical weight. She washed the dishes first, scrubbing the plates and cups and forks with more vigor than necessary, as if clean dishes could somehow make her belong here. Then she swept the floor, shook out the rag rugs, wiped down the table and sideboard. The work was familiar, comforting in its mindlessness. When the cabin was clean, she ventured outside. The morning was crisp and clear, the sky a pale blue that seemed to go on forever. The ranch spread before her, the barn and outbuildings, the corrals with horses moving restlessly in the cold air, the vast expanse of grassland rolling away toward the mountains. It was beautiful and terrible all at once, so much space that it made her feel impossibly small. She found the garden plot Caleb had mentioned, a patch of ground behind the house enclosed by a low fence. The earth was hard and dormant now, waiting for spring, but she could see where rows had once been planted, could imagine green shoots pushing through the soil, could picture herself working here, coaxing life from the ground. The thought steadied her. She was inspecting the shed, finding hoes and rakes and a spade with a well-worn handle, when she heard the sound of approaching wagons. Her stomach clenched. The Reverend. The witnesses. The moment when everything would become real and irreversible. She hurried back to the cabin, smoothing her dress, tucking stray wisps of hair behind her ears. Through the window, she watched as 2 wagons rolled into the yard, one driven by a portly man in ministerial black, a plump woman beside him, the other by a younger man with a red beard and curious eyes. Caleb emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his trousers. He greeted the arrivals with handshakes and quiet words Maylene couldn't hear from inside. Then he turned toward the cabin, his gaze finding her in the window. He nodded once, a small gesture of reassurance, and started toward the house. Maylene forced herself to step back from the window, to stand straight, to breathe. The door opened and Caleb entered, followed by the others. "Maylene, this is Reverend Hartley and his wife, Constance, and Tom Brennan, the postmaster." Caleb's voice was formal, careful. "This is Maylene Chen, my wife." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Maylene bowed her head in the Chinese fashion, a gesture of respect she couldn't quite abandon even here, even now. "Well," Reverend Hartley said heartily, a professional smile on his broad face, "shall we make this official?" The ceremony, such as it was, took less than 10 minutes. The Reverend read from a worn Bible, asked them both to affirm their vows, had them sign the marriage certificate in a cramped hand while Tom Brennan and Constance Hartley added their signatures as witnesses. Maylene's hand shook as she wrote her name, her old name, for the last time. "And that's that," the Reverend pronounced, closing the Bible with a soft thump. "You're well and truly married in the eyes of the law and the Lord. May your union be blessed with—" "We appreciate you coming out," Caleb interrupted smoothly. "I know it's a long ride from town." If Reverend Hartley was offended by the curtness, he didn't show it. Of course, always happy to solemnize a Christian union." He beamed at Maylene. "Welcome to Wyoming Territory, Mrs. Ridge. I hope you'll join us for services when you're able. We meet every Sunday at the schoolhouse in town." "Thank you," Maylene whispered, the name still foreign in her ears. Mrs. Ridge. As if she could be anyone's, Mrs. Constance Hartley stepped forward, a kind smile softening her round face. "If you need anything, dear, companionship, advice, anything at all, please don't hesitate to call on me. I know how lonely it can be, especially for someone new to the territory." The kindness in her voice nearly undid Maylene. She managed a nod, not trusting herself to speak. Tom Brennan, who had been silent throughout, spoke up. "Ridge, if you're coming into town for supplies anytime soon, I've got a package waiting for you at the post office. Came in on last week's freight." "I'll be in Friday," Caleb said. "We need staples anyway." Good. Tom tipped his hat to Maylene. "Ma'am." And then they were leaving, climbing back into their wagons, the Reverend and his wife chattering as they drove away, Tom Brennan silent and thoughtful. Maylene watched until they disappeared down the rutted road, leaving nothing but a trail of dust hanging in the still air. "That's done then," Caleb said quietly. Maylene turned to face him. In the morning light, she could see the lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair. He looked tired, she realized. Bone tired, the way people looked when they'd been carrying something heavy for too long. "Are you—" She hesitated. "Are you sorry that you went through with it?" "No." The answer came without hesitation. "Are you?" She thought about it, really thought about it. This morning she had woken in a warm bed in a solid house with food in her belly and a name that meant she belonged somewhere. It wasn't love, might never be love, but it was more than she'd had yesterday, more than she'd dared hope for in the long dark years before. "No," she said, "I'm not sorry." Something eased in his expression, a tension she hadn't noticed until it was gone. "Good. That's good." He moved past her to the stove, stirring the fire back to life. "I've got fence work that'll take most of the day. There's cold stew from last night if you get hungry. Help yourself to anything you need." "Caleb?" He paused, glancing back. What do you want me to do?" "Here, I mean, what are my duties?" He frowned. "Duties?" "Yes, cooking, cleaning, mending. What do you need from me?" The frown deepened. "I need you to do whatever makes you comfortable. This is your home now, Maylene. You're not a servant. You're not hired help. He seemed to struggle for words. "You're just here, and that's enough." Before she could respond, he was gone again, striding across the yard toward the north pasture with a toolbox in one hand and a coil of wire over his shoulder. Maylene stood in the doorway and watched him go, confusion warring with something else, something that felt dangerously like hope. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, though it was unlike any rhythm Maylene had known before. Caleb rose before dawn, did his chores, ate breakfast in near silence, and disappeared into the work of the ranch until dusk. Maylene cleaned, cooked, mended, explored the boundaries of her new world with tentative steps. They spoke little, and when they did, the conversations were practical, functional. Where the well was, how to bank the fire at night, which chickens were laying and which had gone broody. But beneath the words, Maylene sensed something growing, some awareness of each other that had nothing to do with language. She learned his patterns, the way he always scraped his boots before entering the house, the way he checked the bolt on the door twice each night, the way his hands never quite stilled, always reaching for something to fix or build or improve. She learned that he liked his coffee strong and his breakfast plain, that he could work for hours without seeming to notice hunger or cold, that he was gentler with the animals than most men were with their own children. And slowly, carefully, she began to make small changes to the house. She found wildflowers growing in a sheltered spot near the creek and picked a handful, arranging them in a tin cup on the table. Caleb said nothing when he saw them, but the next day there were more flowers, and she noticed he'd placed them carefully in the center where they caught the afternoon light. She sewed new curtains from fabric she found in a trunk in the barn, cheerful yellow calico that brightened the dim interior. When she hung them, Caleb stopped in the doorway on his way to evening chores, his eyes traveling over them with an expression she couldn't quite read. "They're nice," he said finally. "Cheerful." It was such a small thing, but his approval warmed her more than the fire ever could. One evening, nearly a week after the Reverend's visit, Caleb came in from the barn carrying a package wrapped in brown paper. He set it on the table beside her mending and stood there awkwardly, his hat in his hands. "What is it?" Maylene asked. "Boots," he said. "I noticed yours are worn through. These should fit. They were Sarah's, but she never wore them much. Too stiff," she said. Maylene unwrapped the package slowly, revealing a pair of sturdy leather boots, barely scuffed. They were practical, well made, the kind of boots that would last years if cared for properly. "I can't," she whispered. "These were your wife's. They're just boots, and they're no good to her now." His voice was gentle but firm. "Try them on." She did, and they fit perfectly. A little stiff, as Sarah had said, but solid and warm. She stood and took a few experimental steps, marveling at how different the floor felt beneath proper soles instead of her thin slippers. "They're perfect," she said, looking up at him. "Thank you." He nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his mouth. "Can't have you slipping on the ice when winter comes. You'll need good footing." When winter comes. The words carried an assumption that she would still be here, that this fragile arrangement they'd built would hold against the cold months ahead. That night, after Caleb had gone to the barn, as he did every night, Maylene sat by the fire and allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she'd been avoiding. She was no longer simply surviving. Somewhere in the space between the silent breakfasts and the wordless evenings, between the flowers on the table and the boots by the door, something had shifted. She was beginning to belong. The realization terrified her because belonging meant having something to lose. And Maylene had learned long ago that everything could be taken away. The first snow came on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after the Reverend's visit. Maylene woke to an unfamiliar silence, the kind that pressed against the windows and muffled the world beyond recognition. She rose and pulled back the curtain to find everything transformed. The brown landscape turned pristine white, the mountains ghostly in the distance. Her breath caught. She had seen snow before, in the mountains above Canton during one particularly harsh winter, but never like this. Never so much. So complete, as if the world itself had been erased and rewritten in a language she didn't know how to read. When she emerged from the bedroom, Caleb was already dressed, layering on a heavy coat lined with sheepskin. He glanced at her, then at the window. "First one always comes early this far north," he said. "Won't be the last. You warm enough at night?" "Yes." It was true. The quilts he'd provided were thick and well made, and the cabin held heat better than any place she'd lived before. "Good. I need to check the stock, make sure they're all in from pasture. Might be gone most of the morning." He paused, his hand on the door latch. "Stay inside. The snow looks peaceful, but it's easy to lose your bearings in a whiteout. People have frozen to death 50 feet from their own front door." The words should have frightened her, but instead they felt oddly like care, a rough-edged concern that he tried to disguise as practical instruction. She nodded, and he disappeared into the white morning, his figure swallowed almost immediately by the falling snow. Maylene made coffee and breakfast, though she had no appetite. She stood at the window with her cup cradled in both hands, watching the snow accumulate on the fence posts, on the roof of the barn, on the world beyond her reach. The isolation she had felt since arriving suddenly felt absolute, as if she and Caleb were the only two people left in existence, bound together by circumstance and weather, and a legal document signed in cramped handwriting. Hours passed. The snow continued to fall, thick and relentless. Maylin cleaned what had already been cleaned, mended what didn't need mending, paced the cabin like a caged animal. Her worry grew with each passing minute. What if something had happened? What if Caleb had fallen, injured himself, was lying somewhere in the snow while she stood here warm and useless? She was reaching for her coat, Caleb's warnings be damned, when the door opened and he stumbled inside, covered in snow from hat to boots, his face red with cold. "The stock?" she asked, hurrying toward him. "Safe. All accounted for." His words came out clipped, his jaw tight. He shrugged out of his coat, and she saw him wince, his left hand moving stiffly. "You're hurt." "It's nothing. Scraped it on a fence post." "Let me see. Maylin, let me see." He hesitated, then extended his hand. The knuckles were torn and bleeding, the skin around them already beginning to swell. It wasn't a serious injury, but it needed cleaning, needed care. "Sit," she commanded, pointing to the chair by the fire. To her surprise, he obeyed. She heated water, found clean cloth, brought the basin to him. As she knelt beside the chair and took his hand in hers, she felt him tense. "This will sting," she warned, and began to clean the wound with careful, gentle strokes. He said nothing, but she could feel his eyes on her, watching. The silence stretched between them, different from their usual comfortable quiet, charged somehow, weighted with things neither of them knew how to say. "My mother used to do this," Maylene said softly, not sure why she was speaking, only knowing that the silence had become too heavy to bear. "When I was small and would fall, scrape my knees, she would clean the wounds and tell me stories to distract me from the pain." "What kind of stories?" "Foolish ones. About the Monkey King and his adventures. About the moon goddess who lives in the sky. About brave daughters who saved their families." She bound his hand with clean cloth, her fingers deft and sure. "She died when I was 12. Fever, during the famine. After that, there was no one to clean my wounds or tell me stories." "I'm sorry." She looked up at him, found his gray eyes steady on hers. "Why?" "You didn't cause the famine. You didn't make my uncle cruel or the matchmaker mercenary. You didn't create the world that told me I was worthless." "No, but I'm still sorry you had to live in it." The simple sincerity of his words cracked something inside her chest. She stood quickly, gathering the soiled cloths, needing distance before she did something foolish like cry or speak the truth of how much his kindness undid her. "You should rest that hand," she said, her voice unsteady. "No heavy work for a day or two. Can't rest on a ranch. Stock needs feeding, water needs hauling, fences need—" "Then I'll help." He stared at her. "You?" "Why not? I have 2 working hands. You have 1.5. Together we make a whole person, yes?" She managed a small smile, though her heart was hammering. "You said this was my home. Let me be useful in it." Something shifted in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or a kind of cautious respect. "It's hard work, cold. You're not used to—" "I carried water buckets up 3 flights of stairs in my uncle's house every morning for 6 years, she interrupted. "I scrubbed floors on my hands and knees until my fingers bled. I worked in a laundry in San Francisco 12 hours a day for 3 months to earn passage money. Don't tell me I'm not used to hard work." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "All right then. We'll start after lunch. But you wear those boots and the heavy coat I saw in Sarah's trunk. And if you get cold, you come straight back inside. Deal?" "Deal." They shook on it, his bandaged hand gentle in hers, and Maylene felt something shift between them, some barrier lowered, some wall beginning to crumble. That afternoon, bundled in Sarah's old coat and the sturdy boots Caleb had given her, Maylene followed him out into the snow. He showed her how to break the ice on the water troughs, how to scatter hay for the horses, how to check the chickens for signs of cold stress. The work was hard and her muscles screamed protest, but there was a satisfaction in it, a purpose that had nothing to do with proving her worth and everything to do with simple survival. They worked side by side in near silence, communicating in gestures and glances, their breath rising in clouds in the frozen air. When they finished, the sun was already sinking toward the mountains, turning the snow gold and pink and purple. "You did good," Caleb said as they walked back toward the cabin, their boots crunching in the fresh snow. Maylene glanced at him, surprised by the praise. "I barely did anything." "You did what needed doing. That's more than most." He held the door open for her, and they stepped into the blessed warmth of the cabin together. That night, for the first time since their wedding, Caleb didn't retreat to the barn after supper. Instead, he sat by the fire working on a piece of wood with a small knife, the rhythmic scraping sound oddly soothing. Maylene took up her mending, and they shared the evening in companionable quiet, two solitary people learning to exist in the same space without collision. Just before bed, as Maylene was banking the fire, Caleb cleared his throat. "Thank you," he said, "for the help today, and for—" He gestured vaguely at his bandaged hand. "You don't need to thank me for basic decency." "Maybe not, but I'm doing it anyway." Their eyes met across the dim room, and something passed between them. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition. Two people who had learned to expect nothing beginning to hope for something. "Good night, Caleb," Maylene said softly. "Good night." She retreated to her room, but sleep was slow to come. Through the walls, she could hear him moving about, the creak of floorboards, the soft sounds of a man settling in for the night. And for the first time since arriving, she didn't feel quite so alone. The snow continued for 3 more days, accumulating in drifts that reached halfway up the fence posts. Maylene and Caleb fell into a new routine, morning chores done together, breakfast eaten in comfortable quiet, afternoons spent on separate tasks that somehow felt more connected than solitary. She cooked and cleaned and mended while he worked on equipment repairs in the barn, but now there was an awareness between them, a thread that tied them together even when they were apart. On the 4th day, the snow finally stopped, and the sun emerged, brilliant and cold. Caleb announced he needed to ride into town for supplies. They were running low on flour and coffee, and the package Tom Brennan had mentioned still waited at the post office. "I'll be back before dark," he said, saddling his horse in the barn, while Maylene watched from the doorway. "You'll be all right here?" "I'll be fine." She hesitated, then added, "Be careful." He glanced at her, something warm flickering in his eyes. "I will." She watched him ride away, his figure growing smaller against the white landscape until he disappeared entirely. The silence that settled over the ranch in his absence felt different from before. Not oppressive, but somehow expectant, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Maylene threw herself into work to distract from the strange emptiness. She scrubbed the floors until they gleamed, kneaded bread dough until her arms ached, organized the pantry with meticulous care. But no amount of work could quiet the unease that grew as the afternoon wore on, and Caleb didn't return. Dusk came early, the sun sinking behind the mountains and taking its meager warmth with it. Maylene lit the lamps and started a stew, trying to ignore the worry gnawing at her stomach. The town wasn't far, a 3-hour ride on a good day. But the snow had made the roads treacherous, and a horse could stumble, a rider could fall. She was pacing the cabin for the 100th time when she heard the sound of hoofbeats in the yard. Relief flooded through her so intensely it left her dizzy. She rushed to the door and flung it open just as Caleb dismounted, his arms full of packages. "You're late," she said, then immediately regretted how it sounded, like an accusation, like she had the right to question his movements. But Caleb just smiled, a real smile that transformed his weathered face. "Road was slow. Snow's deeper than I thought." He carried the packages inside, setting them on the table. "Got your supplies. And something else." He pulled a smaller package from his coat and handed it to her. Maylene took it hesitantly, confused. Inside was a length of fabric, deep red silk embroidered with delicate flowers in gold thread. Chinese silk, unmistakably, the kind she hadn't seen since leaving Canton. Her throat tightened. "Where did you—" "Chinese merchant in town. He sets up shop once a month, sells goods from San Francisco." I thought, Caleb shifted his weight, suddenly awkward. I thought you might like something that reminded you of home. Maylene ran her fingers over the silk, feeling its familiar smoothness, seeing in its intricate patterns all the things she had left behind. Her mother's gentle hands, the sound of her language spoken without shame, a world where she had once belonged without question. It's beautiful, she whispered. But you didn't have to. I wanted to. His voice was firm. You've been working hard, making this place a home. You deserve something just for you. The kindness was almost more than she could bear. She clutched the silk to her chest, words failing her, emotions she couldn't name flooding through her. Thank you, she finally managed. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. He began unpacking the other supplies, flour, coffee, sugar, salt. I also got this. He pulled out a single wildflower, somehow preserved despite the cold journey, its petals still bright against his calloused palm. It was nothing like the elaborate silk, just a simple bloom probably picked on the roadside, but the gesture struck her as infinitely more meaningful. For the table, he said, almost shy, since you seem to like them. Maylene took the flower with trembling fingers and placed it in the tin cup that had become their makeshift vase. Such a small thing, a scrap of color in the middle of winter, but it felt like a promise, like hope given physical form. Caleb, she said softly, why are you being so kind to me? He looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes steady and serious. Because you're my wife. Because you deserve kindness. Because... He paused, seeming to weigh his words. Because I know what it's like to feel like you don't belong anywhere, and I don't want you to feel that way here. The honesty in his voice broke down the last of her defenses. Tears spilled over before she could stop them, and she turned away quickly, embarrassed by her weakness. She felt rather than saw him move closer. His hand touched her shoulder, tentative and careful, as if she were something fragile that might shatter under too much pressure. I'm sorry, she choked out. I don't mean to cry. I'm not usually... It's all right. His voice was gentle. You've been holding yourself together for a long time. Sometimes a person needs to fall apart a little. His understanding undid her completely. The sobs came harder, years of suppressed grief and loneliness and fear pouring out of her in waves she couldn't control. And through it all, Caleb stood beside her, his hand steady on her shoulder, saying nothing but somehow saying everything. When the tears finally subsided, Maylene felt hollow and exhausted, but also somehow lighter, as if she'd set down a burden she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. I'm sorry, she said again, wiping her face with her sleeve. Stop apologizing for being human. Caleb's voice was rough, but not unkind. You've got nothing to be sorry for. She looked up at him, this quiet man who had married her sight unseen, who gave her space when she needed it and stability when she didn't, who brought her silk and wildflowers and asked for nothing in return. I don't understand you, she confessed. The matchmaker said men wanted wives who were pretty and young and agreeable. I'm none of those things, so why? The matchmaker was wrong. He said it flatly, as if stating an obvious fact. Pretty fades, young passes, agreeable is just another word for silent. I didn't want any of that. Then what did you want? A partner. Someone who could stand beside me, not behind me. Someone who understood that life out here is hard and lonely and doesn't leave room for pretty lies. He held her gaze. Someone honest. I'm honest because I have nothing else to offer. That's where you're wrong. His hand moved from her shoulder to gently brush a tear from her cheek, the gesture so tender it stole her breath. You've offered me more in 2 weeks than most people offer in a lifetime. You've made this house feel like a home again. You've worked beside me without complaint. You've brought color and life into a place that was just existing. That's just survival. That's what women do. We adapt, we make do, we create homes from nothing because we have no other choice. Maybe. He dropped his hand but didn't step away. But the way you do it matters, the care you take, the thought you put into even small things. That's not just survival, Maylene. That's choosing to live. The words settled into her like seeds taking root. She had spent so long thinking of herself as merely surviving, enduring, getting through one day at a time. But maybe Caleb was right. Maybe somewhere along the way, without even realizing it, she had started choosing life instead of just accepting it. The stew's burning, Caleb said suddenly, breaking the moment. Maylene rushed to the stove, pulling the pot from the heat. The bottom was slightly scorched, but salvageable. She stirred it vigorously, glad for something to do with her hands, for a problem she knew how to fix. They ate quietly, but the silence felt different now. Warmer, more intimate. Maylene found herself watching Caleb when she thought he wasn't looking, noticing small things she'd missed before. The way his hands moved with unconscious grace, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the quiet strength in the line of his jaw. After dinner, he surprised her by pulling a checkerboard from beneath his bed. "You play?" he asked. I don't know. I've never tried. I'll teach you." They sat across from each other at the table, the board between them, and Caleb patiently explained the rules. Maylene was a quick study, and within a few games she was giving him real competition. When she finally won a match, she looked up to find him smiling at her with something that looked dangerously like pride. "You're a fast learner," he said. "I had to be. Slow learners didn't last long in my uncle's house." The smile faded. "Your uncle sounds like a hard man." "He was, but he's also the reason I'm here, in a strange way. If he'd been kinder, I might have stayed, might never have had the courage to leave." She moved a checker piece thoughtfully. "Sometimes the worst things in our lives lead us to the best things." "You think this is one of the best things?" He gestured vaguely at the cabin, at himself. "Being stuck out here with a taciturn rancher twice your age?" Maylene considered the question seriously. 2 weeks ago, she would have said she was simply making the best of a bad situation. Now, sitting across from this man who had shown her more genuine kindness than anyone in years, she wasn't so sure. "I think," she said carefully, "that I'm beginning to believe it could be." Something blazed to life in his eyes, hope, fierce and sudden. He reached across the board and took her hand, his touch warm and solid. "I want you to know something," he said. "I don't expect anything from you that you're not ready to give. This marriage, it can be whatever we make it, partnership, friendship, or," he hesitated, "or more if that's something you ever want. But there's no rush, no pressure. We've got time." Maylene's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked down at their joined hands, his calloused and scarred, hers small and rough from work, and felt the weight of possibility settle over her like a blanket. "Time," she repeated softly. "Yes, I think we need that. Then we'll take it." He squeezed her hand once, gently, then released it. "Another game?" They played late into the night, the fire burning low, the cabin wrapped in warmth and quiet companionship. When Maylene finally rose to go to bed, Caleb walked her to her door, a courtesy he'd never extended before. "Good night, Maylene," he said, and there was something in the way he said her name that made it sound like a promise. "Good night, Caleb." She closed the door and leaned against it, her hand pressed to her racing heart. Through the wood, she could hear him moving about, preparing for bed. And for the first time since arriving, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like if there were no walls between them, if the distance they maintained was bridged not by necessity, but by choice. The thought both terrified and thrilled her. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the sun turning the snow-covered landscape into a field of diamonds. Maylene woke earlier than usual, some restless energy driving her from bed before first light. She dressed quickly and emerged to find Caleb already up, standing at the window with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold and rose. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked without turning. "Too much on my mind." "Yeah." He glanced at her. "Me too." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the day arrive. And Maylene realized with a start that she was happy, not just content or resigned or making do, but genuinely happy. It was such an unfamiliar feeling that she almost didn't recognize it. "Caleb," she said impulsively, "will you teach me to ride?" He raised an eyebrow. "A horse?" "No, a buffalo." She managed a small smile. "Yes, a horse. If I'm going to live here, I should know how. In case..." She didn't finish the thought. "In case something happens to you, in case I need to get help, in case I need to save myself." But he understood. He always seemed to understand. "All right," he said. "After chores, I'll introduce you to Daisy. She's the gentlest mare I've got." That afternoon, true to his word, Caleb led Maylene to the corral where a dappled gray mare stood placidly munching hay. She was smaller than the other horses, with kind eyes and a patient demeanor. "This is Daisy," Caleb said, stroking the mare's neck. "Sarah used to ride her. She hasn't been worked much since, well, she'll be good for you." Maylene approached cautiously, extending her hand the way Caleb showed her. Daisy snuffled at her palm, her breath warm against Maylene's cold fingers. "She likes you," Caleb observed. "How can you tell?" "She's not trying to bite you. That's a good start." He spent the next hour teaching her the basics: how to approach the horse, how to check her hooves, how to saddle and bridle her. His patience was infinite, his instructions clear, and when Maylene finally swung herself awkwardly into the saddle, she felt a surge of accomplishment that made her grin. "How does it feel?" Caleb asked, standing beside Daisy's head, one hand on the bridle. "Terrifying. Wonderful. Both." He smiled. "That about sums up most worthwhile things in life." He led them around the corral at a walk, showing her how to hold the reins, how to use her legs to guide the horse, how to sit balanced and secure. Maylene's muscles protested the unfamiliar position, but she refused to complain. This was freedom, the ability to move independently across this vast land, to not be entirely dependent on Caleb for everything. After an hour, her legs were trembling and her back ached, but she'd managed to walk Daisy around the corral on her own, Caleb watching with quiet approval. "That's enough for today," he said, helping her dismount. "You did well." Maylene's legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground, and Caleb steadied her with hands on her shoulders. "Careful. You'll be sore tomorrow." "I'm sore now." But she was smiling despite the discomfort. They stood close together in the fading light, his hands still on her shoulders, her face tilted up to his. The moment stretched, charged with possibility, and Maylene's breath caught as she saw something shift in his expression, a hunger quickly banked, a want firmly controlled. Then he stepped back, releasing her, putting proper distance between them. "Come on," he said, his voice slightly rough. "Let's get inside before we freeze." That night, after a quiet dinner, Caleb surprised her again by pulling out a worn book. "I thought maybe I could read to you," he said, "if you'd like. It's a collection of poems. Sarah used to enjoy them." Maylene settled into her chair by the fire, her mending in her lap, and listened as Caleb read in his low, steady voice. The poems were about nature and seasons and the passage of time, and his voice gave them a weight and beauty that made her chest ache. When he finished and closed the book, Maylene set aside her mending. "That was lovely, thank you. I'm not much of a reader," he admitted, "but sometimes words help make sense of things." "Yes," she agreed softly. "Sometimes they do." She thought of her own language, the one she rarely spoke now, the one that lived in her mind like a secret garden she visited alone. She thought of all the things she wanted to say to this man, but didn't have the courage for, all the feelings taking root inside her that she didn't know how to name. "Caleb," she said hesitantly, "can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask. Do you still love her? Sarah?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I cared for her, respected her, but love..." He shook his head slowly. "I don't know if what we had was love. It was companionship, mutual survival. She needed a home, and I needed someone." He looked at Maylene. "Why do you ask?" "I wanted to know if I'm competing with a ghost." "No." The answer came swift and certain. "Whatever Sarah and I had, it was its own thing. It doesn't touch this, doesn't touch you." "And what is this?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "What are we?" Caleb studied her, his expression serious. "I don't know yet, but I'd like to find out, if you would." The honesty in his words, the openness, terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She wanted to say yes, wanted to step into the unknown with this man who had shown her nothing but steadiness and care. But fear held her back, the old familiar fear that she wasn't enough, would never be enough, that one day he would wake up and see her clearly and realize his mistake. "I'm afraid," she confessed. "Of what?" "Of hoping, of wanting, of believing this is real, and then having it taken away." Caleb leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, His eyes locked on hers. I can't promise nothing will ever hurt you. I can't promise life won't be hard or that we won't struggle. But I can promise you this. I see you, Mei-Lin. Not some idea of what I want you to be, but who you actually are. And I'm not going anywhere. The words settled into her like warmth spreading through cold limbs. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust in the steady strength of his presence. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. Do what? Any of it. Be a wife. Build a life with someone. Trust that I'm wanted. Then we'll figure it out together. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. One day at a time. No pressure, no expectations. Just being. Mei-Lin looked down at their joined hands and felt something loosen in her chest, some tight coil of fear beginning to unwind. Maybe she didn't have to have all the answers. Maybe it was enough to simply take the next step, and then the next, trusting that the path would reveal itself as she walked it. All right, she said quietly. Together. His smile was soft and genuine, transforming his weathered face. Together. They sat by the fire until late, hands linked, talking quietly about small things. His plans for the ranch come spring, her ideas for the garden, stories from their separate pasts that they were slowly beginning to share. And when they finally parted for bed, Mei-Lin felt something new taking root inside her. Not just hope, but the fragile, tentative beginning of trust. The following Saturday, Caleb announced they would go into town together for supplies. Mei-Lin's stomach twisted with anxiety at the prospect, but she nodded and dressed in her best dress, the dark green one she'd saved for special occasions, though what constituted special in her life had always been unclear. The ride to town took nearly 3 hours, with Mei-Lin seated beside Caleb on the wagon bench, wrapped in Sarah's heavy coat and a thick blanket. The landscape rolled past in shades of white and brown, punctuated by the dark sentinels of pine trees and the occasional ranch house standing alone against the vast sky. Caleb pointed out landmarks as they traveled, the creek where he fished in summer, the ridge where elk gathered in autumn, the spot where he'd built his first shelter when he'd claimed this land 15 years ago. It was just a lean-to then, he said, his breath clouding in the cold air. Dirt floor, canvas roof. I lived in it 2 winters before I could afford lumber for a proper house. That must have been hard. It was what it was. Everyone starts somewhere. He glanced at her. You cold? A little. He shifted the reins to one hand and drew her closer with his arm around her shoulders, tucking the blanket more securely. The gesture was casual, practical, but Mei-Lin's heart raced at the proximity, at the solid warmth of him against her side. Better? Yes. The word came out barely above a whisper. They continued in silence, and gradually Mei-Lin relaxed against him, letting herself absorb his warmth, his steadiness. The rhythm of the horse's hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels became a kind of music, and she found herself almost content despite her nervousness about facing the town. When they finally crested a hill and the settlement came into view, Mei-Lin's breath caught. It was smaller than she'd imagined, a single main street lined with wooden buildings, their false fronts making them appear grander than they were. A church steeple rose at one end, a schoolhouse at the other, and between them clustered the general store, the post office, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, and a handful of other establishments she couldn't identify from this distance. It's not much, Caleb said, misinterpreting her silence, but it's got what we need. It's fine, Mei-Lin managed, though her hands were trembling beneath the blanket. As they rolled down the main street, faces turned to watch. Mei-Lin felt the weight of their stares like physical pressure, saw the curiosity in their eyes, the whispers passed behind gloved hands. She made herself sit straight, chin up, even as shame crawled hot up her neck. She knew what they saw. The Chinese woman, foreign and strange, married to one of their own. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store and set the brake. You want to come in or wait here? I'll come. She wouldn't hide, wouldn't give them the satisfaction of her fear. He helped her down from the wagon, his hand steady on her elbow, and they walked together into the store. A bell jangled above the door and conversation stopped. 3 women clustered near the counter turned to stare. A man weighing nails looked up sharply. Behind the counter, the proprietor, a thin man with shrewd eyes, straightened. Morning, Ridge, he said cautiously. Morning, Garrett. Need to stock up on staples, flour, sugar, coffee, salt, and I'll take whatever dried goods you've got. Beans, rice if you have it. Sure thing. Garrett's eyes slid to Maylin, then quickly away. This the new missus? This is my wife, Maylene. Caleb's voice was firm, leaving no room for question. Maylene, this is Frank Garrett. He runs the store. Maylene bowed her head slightly, a gesture of respect. Mr. Garrett. Ma'am? The word was stiff, uncomfortable in his mouth. The women near the counter whispered among themselves, not even bothering to lower their voices. Maylene caught fragments. Mail order bride. All the way from China. Wonder what he was thinking. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, just moved through the store gathering supplies with deliberate calm. Maylin followed, keeping her eyes down, her hands folded, trying to make herself as small and unobtrusive as possible. Mrs. Ridge? The voice was female, warm, and familiar. Maylene looked up to find Constance Hartley approaching, a kind smile on her round face. Mrs. Hartley. Relief flooded through Maylene. Please call me Constance. I'm so glad to see you in town. She reached out and took Maylene's hand in both of hers, the gesture deliberate and public. How are you settling in? Is Caleb treating you well? Yes, very well. He's been... Maylene searched for words. He's been kind. I'm glad to hear it. Constance squeezed her hand, then turned to include the other women in her voice, speaking loud enough for them to hear. Ladies, have you met Mrs. Ridge, Caleb's wife? The women approached reluctantly, their faces a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Constance made introductions. Margaret Walsh, the schoolteacher, Dorothy Brennan, the postmaster's wife, Susan Crawford, whose husband owned the largest ranch in the territory. Pleasure, Margaret said, though her tone suggested otherwise. Welcome to our community, Dorothy added, with slightly more warmth. Susan simply nodded, her eyes assessing Maylene from head to toe, clearly finding her wanting. Mrs. Ridge is from Canton, Constance continued, undeterred by the cool reception. Imagine the courage it took to travel all that way to make a new life here. I think that's admirable, don't you? The question hung in the air, challenging them to disagree. Margaret shifted uncomfortably. Dorothy's expression softened slightly. I suppose it does take courage, Dorothy conceded. The journey must have been difficult. It was, Maylene said quietly, finding her voice. But I'm grateful to be here now. Well, Susan said briskly, I'm sure you'll adjust in time, though winter can be trying for those not accustomed to it. It wasn't quite an insult, but it wasn't kindness either. Before Maylene could respond, Constance linked her arm through Maylene's. I was just about to visit the fabric shop. Would you like to join me, Mrs. Ridge? I'm making new curtains and could use a second opinion. Maylene glanced toward Caleb, who was at the counter settling accounts with Garrett. He caught her eye and gave a small nod. Yes, I'd like that. Wonderful. Constance steered her toward the door, calling back to the other women. Ladies, we'll see you at the next quilting circle. Outside, Constance's cheerful expression faltered slightly. I hope I didn't overstep. You look like you could use a rescue. Thank you, Maylene said sincerely. I did. They'll come around, Constance assured her as they walked toward a small shop 2 doors down. People here are suspicious of anything new, but once they get to know you, once they see you're not so different from them, they'll warm up. Maylene wasn't sure she believed that, but she appreciated the kindness nonetheless. The fabric shop was small but well stocked, bolts of cloth lining the walls in a rainbow of colors. The proprietress, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, no relation, but the shared surname made Maylene's chest ache with unexpected homesickness, greeted them warmly. You're Caleb Ridge's new bride, Mrs. Chen said in accented English, then switched to Cantonese so fluid Maylene nearly wept with relief. I heard another Chinese woman had come to town. It's good to see a familiar face. Maylene responded in kind, the words tumbling out in her native tongue, and for several minutes they spoke rapidly while Constance looked on with patient incomprehension. Mrs. Chen asked about Canton, about her family, about how she was managing, and Maylene found herself answering honestly, unburdening herself to this stranger who somehow felt like home. Your husband, Mrs. Chen said finally, switching back to English for Constance's benefit. He is a good man? Yes, Maylene said without hesitation. He is. Then you are lucky. Many of us were not so fortunate. She patted Maylene's hand. Come visit me when you can. It helps to speak in the language of your heart sometimes. I will, thank you. When they left the shop, Constance having purchased fabric and Maylene having gained something more valuable than cloth, they found Caleb waiting by the wagon, supplies loaded, his expression patient. Everything all right? He asked. Yes? Maylene smiled, a real smile. Everything's fine. The ride home was quieter than the journey into town, but the silence felt comfortable rather than strained. As the ranch came into view, Maylene realized with a start that she was glad to see it. This rough cabin in the middle of nowhere had become, in some indefinable way, hers. That evening, as they prepared dinner together, Maylene chopping vegetables while Caleb tended the stove, he cleared his throat. You handled yourself well today, in town. I barely said anything. You didn't hide, that takes strength. He paused. I know it wasn't easy, the staring, the whispers, but you held your head up. Mrs. Hartley helped. Constance is good people, but it was you who made the choice to be brave. Maylene set down her knife. I don't feel brave. I feel terrified most of the time. That's what makes it brave. He turned from the stove to look at her. Being scared and doing the thing anyway. Their eyes met across the small kitchen, and Maylene felt that now familiar pull, that draw toward him that both frightened and compelled her. She wanted to close the distance between them, wanted to step into his space and see what might happen, but fear held her back. Not fear of him, but fear of her own wanting, of the vulnerability that came with hoping for more. The moment stretched, charged with possibility, until a log in the fire popped loudly and broke the spell. Caleb turned back to the stove, and Maylene resumed chopping, but something had shifted between them, some acknowledgement of the tension building like pressure before a storm. After dinner, they sat by the fire as had become their custom, Caleb reading from the worn poetry book while Maylene worked on a dress she was making from the red silk he'd bought her. The fabric whispered beneath her fingers, and she imagined wearing it, imagined Caleb's eyes on her in something beautiful instead of practical. Maylene, he said suddenly, lowering the book. Yes? There's a barn dance next month. The whole community comes together, celebrates the end of winter. He seemed uncomfortable. It's expected that married couples attend together. If you'd rather not, if it's too much after today, I'll understand. A barn dance. The thought filled her with equal parts dread and longing. She had never danced, had never been to any kind of social gathering where she was anything other than an outsider looking in. But the image of moving through the steps with Caleb, his hand in hers, his attention focused on her. Will you teach me? She asked. To dance? Surprise flickered across his face. You want to go? I want to try. If I'm going to live here, I need to be part of this community, even if they don't want me yet. She set aside her sewing. But I don't know how to dance. I'll embarrass you. You couldn't embarrass me if you tried. He stood and extended his hand. Come here. Maylene rose hesitantly and placed her hand in his. He drew her to the center of the room, positioning her carefully. One hand in his, the other resting on his shoulder, his free hand settling at her waist. The intimacy of the position made her heart race. It's just a simple waltz, he said, his voice low. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Follow my lead. He began to move, counting softly, guiding her through the steps. Maylene stumbled at first, her feet tangling with his, but he was patient, adjusting his pace to match hers. Gradually, she found the rhythm, her body learning the pattern even as her mind struggled to comprehend that she was here, in Caleb Ridge's arms, dancing in the firelight like something from a dream. You're doing well, he murmured. I'm stepping on your feet. Barely. His hand tightened slightly at her waist. You're a natural. They moved together in the quiet cabin. No music but the crackle of the fire and their own breathing. Maylene found herself looking up at him, studying his face in the flickering light, the strong line of his jaw, the small scar above his eyebrow, the gray eyes that held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Caleb, she whispered. Yes? Thank you for everything, for bringing me here, for being patient, for not... She couldn't finish. For not what? For not expecting me to be something I'm not. His hand moved from her waist to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. I don't want you to be anything but exactly who you are. The words broke something open inside her, some last barrier she'd been clinging to. She swayed toward him, drawn by a force she couldn't name and didn't want to resist. His head lowered, slowly, giving her time to pull away. But she didn't. She couldn't. His lips touched hers, soft and questioning, and Maylene's eyes fluttered closed. The kiss was gentle, reverent, nothing like the brutal claiming she'd feared marriage might bring. It tasted of coffee and hope and promises unspoken, and when he pulled back, searching her face for her reaction, she found herself leaning forward, seeking more. "Maylene," he breathed, and there was wonder in his voice, as if he couldn't quite believe this was real. "Don't stop," she whispered. "Please." He kissed her again, deeper this time, his arms coming around her to hold her close. Maylene melted into him, her hands moving to tangle in his hair, her body pressed against the solid warmth of him. It was everything she hadn't known she wanted, everything she'd been too afraid to imagine. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "We should stop," he said roughly, "before I forget myself." "What if I don't want you to stop?" "Maylene." It was half warning, half plea. She stepped back, her face flushing with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have—" "No!" He caught her hand, pulled her back. "Don't apologize. Don't ever apologize for wanting. I don't want to rush you. Don't want you to do anything you're not ready for." "How will I know when I'm ready?" "You'll know." He kissed her forehead, her cheek, the corner of her mouth with aching tenderness. "And when you are, I'll be here." That night, Maylene lay in her bed trembling with new awareness, her fingers touching her lips where Caleb had kissed her. Through the walls, she could hear him moving about, and she imagined going to him, closing the distance between their separate rooms, their separate lives. But fear still held her back. Not fear of him, but of the magnitude of what she was beginning to feel. She had never expected to want her husband, had never imagined desire could be gentle instead of violent, could be offered instead of taken. Everything she'd been told about marriage, about men, about what women were expected to endure, all of it was being rewritten by this quiet rancher who treated her like something precious instead of purchased. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. The next morning dawned gray and oppressive, the sky heavy with unshed snow. Maylene woke to an uneasy feeling she couldn't name, a prickling awareness that something was wrong. She dressed quickly and emerged to find Caleb at the window, his posture tense. "Storm coming," he said without turning. "Big one by the look of it. I need to get the stock secured, bring in extra firewood. We might be snowed in for days." "What can I do?" "Fill every pot and bucket we have with water. If the well freezes, we'll need reserves." He finally looked at her, and something in his expression made her stomach clench. "Stay inside once the storm hits. Promise me." "I promise." He grabbed his coat and headed out into the morning, and Maylene set to work filling containers with water, checking their food supplies, making sure they had everything they'd need to weather whatever was coming. The wind began to pick up, rattling the windows, and the temperature dropped perceptibly. By noon, the snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes that obscured the barn from view. Maylene stood at the window, watching anxiously for Caleb's return. Minutes stretched into an hour, then longer, and her worry grew with each passing moment. When he finally stumbled through the door, he was covered in snow and shaking with cold. Maylene rushed to him, helping him out of his ice-crusted coat. "The stock?" she asked. "Safe. All secured." His teeth were chattering. "Storm hit faster than I expected. Nearly lost my way back from the barn." She guided him to the fire, adding wood until it blazed high, then rushed to heat water for coffee. He sat hunched in his chair, his hands extended toward the flames, and she saw they were red and raw, the bandage from his earlier injury soaked through. "Your hand," she said sharply. "It's fine." "It's not fine." She knelt before him as she had before, but this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. She unwrapped the sodden bandage with careful fingers, revealing the wound, inflamed now, the cold having made it worse. "This needs cleaning again, properly." She heated water and cloth, added salt to make a solution, and cleaned the injury with gentle, thorough care. Caleb watched her work, his eyes never leaving her face. "You don't have to do this." he said quietly. Yes, I do. She met his gaze. You take care of me. Let me take care of you. Something shifted in his expression, gratitude perhaps, or something deeper. When she finished binding his hand with fresh cloth, he caught her fingers in his uninjured one. Maylene. Yes? Last night, the kiss, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. Her heart hammered. Neither have I. I meant what I said. I won't push. But I need you to know. He paused, seeming to struggle for words. I need you to know that I care for you. More than I expected to. More than I probably should after such a short time. The confession hung between them, vulnerable and brave. Maylene felt tears prick her eyes. I care for you too, she whispered. It frightens me how much. Why does it frighten you? Because I've never had anything worth losing before. And now I do. He pulled her onto his lap, cradling her against his chest, and she went willingly, burying her face in his shoulder. Outside, the storm raged, the wind howling like something alive, but inside they were warm and safe and together. You're not going to lose me, Caleb murmured into her hair. I'm not going anywhere. You can't promise that. People leave. People die. Nothing lasts forever. Maybe not forever, but we've got now. We've got today and tomorrow and whatever comes after. Isn't that enough? Maylene lifted her head to look at him. I don't know. Is it? Instead of answering, he kissed her, and the kiss was different from the night before. Hungrier, more desperate, colored by the storm outside and the storm building between them. Maylene responded with equal fervor, her hands fisting in his shirt, her body arching against his. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb groaned softly. We need to stop. Why? Because if we don't, I'm going to carry you to that bed and make you truly my wife. And I need to know that's what you want, not just what the moment makes you feel. The rawness in his voice, the need barely held in check, sent heat flooding through her. She could feel his desire, knew her own matched it, but beneath the physical wanting was something more, a need to belong, to be chosen, to matter. I want, she said carefully, to stop being afraid. I want to stop waiting for everything to be taken away. I want to choose something for myself instead of having everything chosen for me. And what are you choosing? She cupped his face in both hands, held his gaze. You, this, us. For a long moment he simply looked at her, searching her face for doubt or hesitation. Whatever he saw there satisfied him, because he stood in one smooth motion, Maylene in his arms, and carried her toward his room. Not hers, she noticed, but his. He set her down gently beside the bed, his hands moving to cup her face. We can still stop, he said hoarsely. If you change your mind. She silenced him with a kiss, pouring into it everything she couldn't say, her trust, her hope, her fragile, tentative love. When she pulled back, she began unbuttoning her dress with shaking fingers. Caleb's hands covered hers, stilling them. Let me. He undressed her slowly, reverently, treating each revealed inch of skin like sacred ground. When she stood before him in just her chemise, trembling with cold and anticipation and nervousness, he wrapped her in the quilt from his bed and simply held her. You're shaking, he murmured. I'm scared. Of me? Of this. Of feeling this much. He kissed her temple, her cheek, her lips. I've got you. I won't let you fall. Promise? I promise. Outside, the storm beat against the cabin with fierce intensity. But inside, in the warm darkness of Caleb's room, Maylene let herself fall. Into his arms, into his care, into the terrifying vulnerability of being truly seen and choosing to stay anyway. What happened between them was tender and patient, Caleb taking his time, showing her with touch and whispered words that she was treasured, desired, wanted. And when it was over and they lay tangled together beneath the quilts, the storm still raging beyond the walls, Maylene felt something fundamental shift inside her. She had been alone for so long, had carried her shame and her loneliness like stones in her pockets, weighing her down until she could barely remember what it felt like to stand straight. But here, in this man's arms, she felt the weight lifting. Not all at once. Some burdens took time to shed, but enough that she could breathe easier, hope more freely. You all right? Caleb asked softly, his hand stroking her hair. Yes. She pressed closer to his warmth. I'm all right. No regrets? She thought about it honestly. Did she regret the vulnerability, the risk, the leap into the unknown? No, she said firmly. No regrets. He tightened his arms around her, and they lay together listening to the storm, two solitary souls who had found unexpected shelter in each other. When Maylene woke hours later, the storm was still raging and Caleb was gone from the bed. Panic seized her briefly. He had left. He had thought better of it. He was regretting what they'd done. But then she heard sounds from the main room and smelled coffee brewing. She rose and dressed quickly, her body aching in unfamiliar ways, and emerged to find Caleb at the stove making breakfast. He looked up when she entered, and the warmth in his eyes drove away the last of her fear. Morning, he said softly. Morning. She moved toward him uncertainly, not sure of the protocol now, not sure how to be with him after such intimacy. He solved the problem by drawing her into his arms and kissing her thoroughly, and when he released her, she was breathless and smiling. I was afraid, she confessed. Of what? That you'd regret it, that everything would be different in the light of day. Everything is different, he agreed, but different doesn't mean worse. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I don't regret a single moment. Do you? No. The truth of it filled her with wonder. I don't. They ate breakfast together, and then, with the storm still keeping them housebound, they spent the day in quiet domesticity, Maylene sewing while Caleb repaired tack, both of them stealing glances at each other, both of them smiling at nothing in particular. That night, there was no question of separate rooms. Maylene went to bed in Caleb's arms and woke there the next morning, and the pattern held for the 3 days the storm lasted. By the time the weather finally broke and the sun emerged, weak but determined, Maylene had memorized the sound of his breathing, the warmth of his skin, the way he held her as if she were something infinitely precious. When they finally ventured outside to assess the damage from the storm, Maylene stood in the doorway and looked out at the transformed landscape, everything pristine and new, buried under feet of fresh snow. The world felt cleansed somehow, reborn, and she felt the same way, as if the storm had swept away all the old fears and doubts, leaving behind only the simple truth of what they were building together. Caleb came up beside her, slipping his arm around her waist. Beautiful, isn't it? He said. Yes, but she wasn't looking at the landscape. She was looking at him. He followed her gaze and smiled, that rare, transformative smile that made him look younger. Come on, let's dig out and make sure the animals survived all right. They worked together in the cold, bright morning, and Maylene felt something settle into place inside her, a sense of belonging, of rightness, of home. She was no longer the unwanted bride, the ugly outsider, the woman who had nothing to offer. She was Maylene Ridge, and she had found her place in the world. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was hers, and that made all the difference. The weeks that followed the storm fell into a new rhythm, one shaped by shared nights and quiet mornings, by work done side by side, and evenings spent in comfortable closeness. Spring began to whisper its arrival in subtle ways, the snow retreating from the southern slopes, the sun climbing higher each day, the first brave shoots of green pushing through the frozen earth. Maylene found herself changing with the seasons. The fear that had defined her for so long was loosening its grip, replaced by something she barely recognized. Contentment, perhaps, or the beginnings of joy. She caught herself humming as she worked, smiling at small things, touching Caleb's hand as she passed him, just for the pleasure of the contact. One morning in early March, she woke to find him already dressed, standing at the window with his coffee. What is it? She asked, rising and wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the lingering chill. Creeks running high, snow melt from the mountains. He glanced at her, his eyes warm. Means spring's really coming. Another few weeks and we can start planting the garden. Maylene moved to stand beside him, and he wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. Together they watched the pink dawn spread across the sky, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of gold and rose. I've been thinking, Caleb said quietly, about the barn dance. What about it? It's next Saturday, and I want... He paused, seeming to search for words. I want to show you off. Want everyone in town to see you on my arm and know how lucky I am. Maylene's throat tightened. You're not worried what they'll think. Let them think what they want. You're my wife, and I'm proud of that. The simple declaration undid her. She turned in his arms and kissed him, pouring into it all the gratitude and affection she couldn't quite put into words. When they broke apart, he was smiling. I'll take that as a yes, then. Yes, she whispered. I want to go. The days leading up to the dance were consumed with preparation. Maylene finished the red silk dress, working late into the evenings by lamplight, her stitches small and precise. The result was beautiful, fitted at the bodice, the skirt falling in graceful folds, the gold embroidery catching the light with every movement. When she tried it on the night before the dance, Caleb's sharp intake of breath told her everything his words couldn't. You look... He stopped, shook his head. There aren't words. It's not too much? She asked anxiously, smoothing the silk over her hips. Too foreign? It's perfect. You're perfect. He crossed the room to her, his hand settling at her waist. Tomorrow night, every man there is going to envy me. And every woman will pity you for being stuck with me. His expression darkened. Don't put their small-mindedness in your mouth. He cupped her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. You are beautiful, Maylene. Not despite who you are, but because of it. And anyone who can't see that is a fool. She wanted to believe him, wanted to see herself through his eyes instead of through the cruel mirror of her uncle's words and the matchmaker's pity. But years of being told she was ugly, unwanted, worthless, had carved deep grooves in her soul, and they wouldn't be smoothed away by a few weeks of kindness. Still, she tried. For him, for herself, for the fragile hope, growing between them like spring flowers pushing through frost-hardened ground. The night of the dance arrived cold and clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the vast Wyoming sky. Caleb brought the wagon around, and Maylene emerged from the cabin in her red silk dress, her hair pinned up with the jade combs her mother had given her, Sarah's good boots on her feet. Caleb helped her up onto the seat, his hand lingering on hers longer than necessary. Ready? He asked. No. She managed a tremulous smile. But let's go anyway. The ride to town seemed both too long and too short, Maylene's anxiety building with each turn of the wheels. By the time they arrived at the barn where the dance was being held, her hands were shaking and her stomach churned with nerves. Music drifted from the open doors, a fiddle and a guitar, lively and bright. Light spilled out into the darkness, and through the doorway Maylene could see couples already dancing, their shadows wheeling across the walls. Caleb set the brake and climbed down, then reached up to help her. Hey, he said softly, catching her trembling hands in his. You don't have to do this. We can turn around right now, go home, and no one will fault you for it. Will you fault me? Never. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders. Then let's go in. They walked together into the barn and conversation stuttered to a halt. Every head turned, every eye fixed on them, on her, in her foreign red silk, her Chinese features, her outsider status made visible and undeniable. Maylene felt the familiar weight of their stares, the judgment, the curiosity, the contempt barely disguised as interest. But Caleb's hand was solid at the small of her back, anchoring her, and she made herself keep walking, keep her chin up, keep breathing. Ridge! A large man with a booming voice approached, his hand extended. Good to see you. And this must be the new Mrs. James Crawford. This is my wife, Maylene. Caleb's voice was firm, proud. Maylene, James owns the Circle C ranch south of us. Ma'am, James tipped his hat, his eyes assessing but not unkind. Welcome. My wife Susan mentioned meeting you in town. As if summoned, Susan Crawford materialized at her husband's elbow, her expression cool and evaluating. Mrs. Ridge, what an interesting dress. Thank you, Maylene said quietly, refusing to hear the insult beneath the compliment. Well, James said heartily, oblivious to the undercurrents, the dancing's about to start. Hope you both enjoy yourselves. They moved off, and other couples approached, some curious, some friendly, some openly hostile. Maylene endured the introductions with as much grace as she could muster, painfully aware of the whispers that followed in their wake. Then Constance Hartley was there, warm and effusive, embracing Maylene like an old friend. You look absolutely stunning, she declared, loud enough for nearby couples to hear. That dress is exquisite. Did you make it yourself? Yes, Maylene managed. Remarkable. Constance turned to include the other women in her voice. We should have a quilting circle soon. I'd love to learn some Chinese embroidery techniques. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. It was a small kindness, but it mattered. A few of the women nodded, their expressions softening marginally. Margaret Walsh, the schoolteacher, even ventured a compliment. The color suits you, she said, and it sounded almost sincere. The musicians struck up a new tune, and Caleb took Maylin's hand. Dance with me? She let him lead her onto the floor, acutely aware of the eyes following them, the whispers intensifying. But then Caleb's arm was around her waist, solid and sure, and they were moving through the steps he'd taught her, and everything else faded to background noise. You're doing beautifully, he murmured. I'm terrified. I know, but you're here anyway. That's what matters. They danced through one song, then another, and gradually Maylene felt her shoulders relax, her steps grow more confident. Other couples joined them on the floor, and the attention shifted, dispersed. By the third dance, she was almost enjoying herself. Then Susan Crawford cut in, her hand on Caleb's arm, her smile bright and false. You don't mind if I borrow your husband for one dance, do you, Mrs. Ridge? Old friends and all that. Before Maylene could respond, Caleb was shaking his head. Actually, Susan, I do mind. I came here to dance with my wife, and that's what I intend to do. Susan's smile froze. How sweet. Though I'm sure Mrs. Ridge could use a rest. She looks a bit overwhelmed. She looks beautiful, Caleb corrected, his voice cool. And she's exactly where she wants to be. Now, if you'll excuse us. He swept Maylene back into the dance, leaving Susan standing alone, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. Around them, Maylene felt the shift in attention, heard the renewed whispers. But this time, they weren't all hostile. Some, she sensed, were admiring. Caleb Ridge, quiet and solitary, publicly claiming his foreign bride and refusing to be swayed by social pressure. You didn't have to do that, Maylene said softly. Yes, I did. His jaw was set, his eyes fierce. I won't have anyone treating you as less than you are. Not Susan Crawford, not anyone. Something warm and fierce bloomed in Maylene's chest. Thank you. Don't thank me for basic decency. They danced until Maylene's feet ached and her face hurt from smiling, and when they finally stepped outside for air, the night was cold and clear and blessedly quiet. You all right? Caleb asked, drawing her into the circle of his arms. More than all right. She leaned into his warmth, gazing up at the stars. I was so scared of tonight, of facing everyone, of being judged and found wanting. But with you beside me, you were magnificent. You are magnificent. He kissed the top of her head. I'm proud of you. The words settled into her like warmth spreading through cold limbs, proud. When had anyone ever been proud of her? When had she ever given anyone reason to be? Caleb, she whispered, I need to tell you something. What is it? I think I'm falling in love with you. She felt him go still, his breath catching. Then he was turning her to face him, his hands framing her face, his eyes searching hers in the starlight. You think? No, she swallowed hard. I know, I love you. I don't know when it happened or how, but I do. And I needed you to know. For a long moment he simply stared at her, and Maylene's heart hammered with sudden fear. Had she said too much, too soon? Had she exposed herself too completely? Then he was kissing her, deep and passionate, his arms crushing her against him with a desperation that spoke louder than words. When he finally pulled back, his voice was rough with emotion. I love you too. Have loved you, I think, since the night you cried in my kitchen and trusted me to see you broken. Maybe even before that. Joy exploded through her, bright and fierce and terrifying in its intensity. Really? Really. He kissed her again, gentler this time. You're the bravest person I've ever met, Maylene Ridge, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know how extraordinary you are. They stood together in the cold night, wrapped in each other's arms, and Maylene felt something fundamental shift inside her, the shame she'd carried for so long. The belief that she was ugly, unwanted, worthless, began to crack and crumble, replaced by the radical possibility that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. Maybe her uncle had been wrong. Maybe everyone who had ever told her she was less than had been wrong. Maybe she was exactly enough. The journey home was quiet, but charged with new awareness, new possibility. When they reached the ranch, Caleb helped her down from the wagon, and they walked together into the cabin, hands linked, hearts full. That night, their lovemaking was different, slower, deeper, infused with the knowledge of their feelings. And afterward, as Maylene lay in Caleb's arms, listening to his breathing slow into sleep, she allowed herself to hope for a future she'd never dared imagine. The next weeks brought a softening to the land, spring asserting itself with increasing confidence. The snow retreated to the highest peaks, wildflowers pushed through the thawing earth, and the creek ran high and fast with snowmelt. Maylene spent long days preparing the garden plot, turning soil that had been frozen hard just weeks before, planning what to plant and where. Caleb worked from dawn to dusk, repairing winter damage, mending fences, preparing for the arrival of new stock he'd ordered from a breeder in Colorado. They fell into an easy partnership, their lives intertwining seamlessly, their love growing deeper with each passing day. One afternoon in late March, Maylene was in the garden plot driving stakes for peas when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw a rider approaching at a fast clip, Dorothy Brennan from town, her face flushed with exertion. "Mrs. Ridge," she called out, pulling her horse to a stop. "Is Caleb here?" "In the barn. What's wrong?" "The Hutchinson place. Fire broke out an hour ago. They're trying to save the stock and the house, but they need every able-bodied man. Can Caleb come?" "Of course." Maylene was already running toward the barn, her heart pounding. Fire was every rancher's nightmare, capable of destroying in minutes what had taken years to build. Caleb emerged at her shout, took one look at Dorothy's face, and was moving toward his horse without needing explanation. "How bad?" "Bad. Started in the barn, spread to the house. Mary Hutchinson got the children out, but Jim's trying to save the animals, and it's not good. I'm on my way." He turned to Maylene, his face grim. "Stay here. Keep the fire watch. If you see smoke anywhere on our property, ring the bell by the barn. Don't try to fight it yourself." "Be careful," she said, gripping his hand hard. "I will." He kissed her quickly, fiercely. "I'll be back as soon as I can." Then he was gone, riding hard toward the smoke visible now on the southern horizon, and Maylene was left standing in the yard with Dorothy. "Is there anything I can do?" Maylene asked. Dorothy hesitated, then said, "Actually, yes. We're gathering at the Hutchinsons to help however we can, watching children, preparing food for the men, salvaging what we can. If you wanted to come..." It was an olive branch, an invitation into the community she'd been held at arm's length from. Maylene didn't hesitate. "Let me get my coat." The ride to the Hutchinson ranch was tense and silent, the smoke growing thicker as they approached. When they arrived, the scene was chaos. Men running with buckets, women herding frightened children away from the flames, animals screaming in panic. The barn was fully engulfed, flames shooting high into the afternoon sky, and the house was burning too, smoke pouring from the upper windows. Maylene threw herself into the work without thought, helping carry water, corralling escaped chickens, comforting terrified children. She found Mary Hutchinson sitting on the ground 20 yards from the burning house, her face streaked with soot and tears, her youngest child clutched in her arms. "Mrs. Hutchinson," Maylene said gently, kneeling beside her. "Are you hurt?" "We lost everything." Mary's voice was hollow, broken. "Everything we built, everything we had, it's all gone. You have your children, you have your husband, the rest can be rebuilt." "Can it?" Mary looked at her with haunted eyes. "How do you rebuild from nothing?" Maylene thought of her own life, the losses she'd endured, the times she'd had to start over with nothing but determination and desperate hope. One day at a time, one choice at a time, you survive and then you live and eventually you have something again. "How do you know?" "Because I've done it." Maylene took Mary's free hand, squeezed it. "And because you're stronger than you think. We all are, when we have to be." The fire burned for hours, despite the best efforts of the men fighting it. By the time it was finally under control, the barn was gone completely and the house was a blackened shell. The roof collapsed, the walls barely standing. Jim Hutchinson stood staring at the ruins with blank eyes, his face gray with shock and exhaustion. Caleb found Maylene among the women tending to the displaced family, his own face smudged with soot, his clothes reeking of smoke. "We should go," he said quietly. "There's nothing more we can do tonight." But before they could leave, Mary Hutchinson approached, her youngest still in her arms. "Mrs. Ridge," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for sitting with me. For—" She couldn't finish, but the gratitude in her eyes said everything. "We're neighbors," Maylene said simply. "We help each other." The ride home was silent, both of them exhausted and shaken. When they reached the ranch, Caleb helped Maylene down from the wagon and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "You were amazing today," he murmured into her hair. "The way you helped, the way you comforted Mary. You gave her hope when she had none left." "I only told her the truth. Sometimes the truth is the bravest thing we can offer." He pulled back to look at her. "I'm so damn proud of you." That night as they lay in bed, Maylene couldn't stop thinking about the Hutchinsons, about how quickly everything could be taken away, how fragile their hold on this life really was. "Caleb," she whispered into the darkness, "are we safe? If something happened, if we had a fire, or if you got hurt, or if—" "Shh," he pulled her closer. "We're as safe as anyone can be out here, and we have each other. That counts for a lot." "Does it count for enough?" "I think so. Don't you?" She thought about it, about this man who had given her shelter and safety and love, about the life they were building together, about the community that was slowly, grudgingly beginning to accept her. It wasn't perfect, wasn't guaranteed, but it was real. And it was hers. "Yes," she said finally, "I think it does." Spring continued its advance, and with it came new rhythms of work and life. Maylene planted the garden, peas and beans and squash and tomatoes, herbs near the house for cooking, even a few flowers for beauty. She tended it daily, watching with fierce satisfaction as green shoots emerged from the dark earth, proof that life could be coaxed from even the hardest ground. One morning in early April, she was weeding the garden when a sharp pain lanced through her hand. She jerked back to find a jagged piece of metal buried in the soil, an old plow blade, perhaps, or a broken tool abandoned years ago. Blood welled from the gash across her palm, deep and angry. She stumbled toward the house, wrapping her hand in her apron, trying to stop the bleeding. Caleb was in the barn, but she didn't want to bother him, didn't want to seem weak or helpless. She could handle this herself. But when she unwrapped the makeshift bandage and saw how deep the cut was, how the blood kept flowing despite the pressure, fear seized her. What if it was serious? What if it became infected? People died from smaller wounds out here, far from doctors and proper care. "Maylene?" She turned to find Caleb in the doorway, his face going pale at the sight of the blood. "What happened?" "It's nothing, just a cut from some—" "That's not nothing." He was beside her in an instant, gently taking her injured hand in his. "Come here, sit down." He guided her to a chair and knelt before her, the same position he'd been in that first night when he'd washed her feet, when he'd shown her she was worth caring for. The parallel wasn't lost on either of them. "This needs stitches," he said grimly, examining the wound. "Can you do it?" "I've stitched plenty of animals. People aren't so different." He looked up at her, his eyes worried. "It's gonna hurt." "I know." He gathered supplies, needle and thread, whiskey for sterilization, clean cloth. Maylene watched him work. This man who had become her anchor, her home, her heart. "I'm scared," she confessed as he threaded the needle. "I know, but I've got you." He took her hand gently, positioned it in the light. "Ready?" She nodded, and he began. The pain was sharp and immediate, making her gasp, but Caleb's touch remained gentle, his movements sure and steady. He worked in silence, his brow furrowed in concentration, and Maylene found herself focusing on his face rather than the pain. The small scar above his eyebrow, the lines around his eyes, the gray threading through his hair at the temples. "Almost done," he murmured. When he finished and bandaged her hand with careful precision, he brought her palm to his lips and kissed it gently. "There. Good as new." "Thank you." Her voice was thick with emotion. "You don't need to thank me." Yes, I do. You take such good care of me. You always have from the very first night. He cupped her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. Because you're mine to care for, and because I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. Tears spilled over, and this time they weren't tears of pain or fear, but of overwhelming gratitude. She had traveled so far, endured so much, carried shame and loneliness for so long, and somehow, impossibly, she had found this: love given freely, care offered without conditions, a man who saw her clearly and chose her anyway. I love you too, she whispered. So much it frightens me sometimes. Don't be frightened, he kissed her softly. Be brave instead, the way you've always been. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, they sat together on the porch, watching the light fade from the sky. Malin's hand throbbed where the stitches pulled, but the pain was bearable, made easier by Caleb's arm around her shoulders. Caleb, she said quietly, do you ever regret it? Sending for a mail-order bride? Taking a chance on someone you'd never met? He was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was thoughtful. I regret a lot of things in my life. Words I didn't say, chances I didn't take, time I wasted being afraid. But you? Marrying you? He shook his head. That's the one thing I'll never regret. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Maylene Ridge, and I thank whatever force in the universe brought you to my door. Maylene leaned into his warmth, watching the stars begin to emerge in the darkening sky. She thought about that terrified woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 2 months ago, convinced she was ugly and unwanted, expecting rejection and shame. She thought about how far she'd come, not just in miles, but in understanding, in courage, in the radical act of believing she deserved love. The journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt, more times when the old fears threatened to overwhelm her. But she wasn't facing them alone anymore. She had Caleb, steady and true, beside her. She had this land, harsh and beautiful, teaching her resilience. She had a community slowly learning to accept her, and work that gave her purpose, and love that gave her strength. She had, against all odds and expectations, found her way home. And as the night deepened around them and the coyotes began their evening song, Maylene allowed herself to feel something she'd thought lost forever. Peace. Not the fragile, temporary peace of survival, but the deep, abiding peace of belonging, of being exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly who she was meant to be with. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything. The spring days lengthened into early summer, and with them came a transformation so complete that Maylene sometimes forgot the frightened woman she had been just months ago. Her garden flourished under her careful tending, rows of green pushing skyward with determined vigor. The peas climbed their stakes, the tomatoes set fruit, and the herbs filled the air near the house with fragrance that reminded her of her mother's cooking, of home in a way that no longer hurt quite so much. Her hand healed cleanly, the stitches leaving only a faint white scar across her palm that Caleb traced sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep, his touch reverent and gentle. The scar became a kind of marker, before and after, fear and trust. The moment she truly understood that his care wasn't temporary or conditional, but woven into the fabric of who he was. One morning in late May, Maylene woke to an unfamiliar sound, rain drumming against the roof, soft and steady. She rose and went to the window to find the world transformed, everything washed clean and glistening, the parched earth drinking deeply after weeks of dry weather. Relief flooded through her. The garden had needed this, and so had she. Some softness after so much hardness, some gentleness after so much struggle. Caleb came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. Good rain, he murmured, gentle enough not to wash out the seedlings, steady enough to soak deep. It's beautiful. So are you. She turned in his arms to face him, still marveling that he could say such things and mean them, that he could look at her the way he did, as if she were something precious and rare instead of ordinary and plain. Caleb Ridge, she said softly, you are either a liar or a fool. Neither. His expression was serious. I'm just a man who sees clearly what's in front of him. She kissed him then, long and deep, trying to pour into it everything his words made her feel, gratitude and wonder and love so fierce it sometimes took her breath away. When they finally broke apart, Both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I've been thinking," he said quietly. "About what?" "About the future. About what comes next." Something in his tone made her heart skip. "What do you mean?" "I mean—" He pulled back to look at her, his gray eyes steady and sure. "I want to build something permanent with you. Not just survive together, but thrive. I want to expand the ranch, maybe get some cattle to go with the horses. I want to build a bigger house with a real bedroom for us, and maybe—" He paused, seeming uncertain for the first time. "Maybe someday, if you wanted, rooms for children." The word hung between them, weighted with possibility. Children. A family. A future that stretched beyond just the two of them, beyond survival and into something richer, fuller. "Do you want that?" Maylene asked carefully. "Children?" "I want whatever you want. If it's just the two of us, that's enough. More than enough. But if you wanted—" He cupped her face. "I think you'd be an amazing mother." Tears pricked her eyes. "I don't know if I would be. I don't know if I know how. None of us know how until we do it. But I've watched you with Mary Hutchinson's children, with the neighbor kids at the barn dance. You're patient and kind and strong. That's all any child really needs. And what if I'm like my uncle? What if I carry his cruelty inside me and pass it on?" "You won't." His voice was firm, certain. "You're nothing like him. You've spent your whole life being the opposite of him, choosing kindness when you could have chosen bitterness, choosing hope when you could have chosen despair. That's who you are, Maylene. Not him. Never him." She wanted to believe it, wanted to trust that she could break the cycle of cruelty and shame, that she could give a child what she'd never had: unconditional love, unwavering acceptance, a home where they were treasured just for existing. "I'm scared," she confessed. "I know, but we don't have to decide anything right now. I just wanted you to know that I'm thinking about it, that I can see that kind of future with you." She nodded, overwhelmed by the enormity of it all. This man, this life, this possibility of becoming something more than what she'd ever imagined for herself. They spent the rainy day inside, comfortable in each other's company, speaking little but saying much through glances and touches and the easy silence of two people who had learned each other's rhythms. By evening, the rain had stopped, leaving everything fresh and new, and they walked together through the garden inspecting the plants, pleased to see them stronger for the watering. "Look," Caleb said, pointing. "Your tomatoes are flowering." Maylene knelt beside the plants, examining the small yellow blooms with satisfaction. "Soon we'll have fruit." "You've done well with this, better than Sarah ever did, and she grew up on a farm." The comparison startled her. Caleb rarely mentioned his first wife, and when he did, it was always in passing, without weight or longing. But now, kneeling beside her in the damp earth, he seemed willing to speak more openly. "Did you love her?" Maylene asked quietly, the question she'd wondered about, but never quite dared to ask. Caleb was silent for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "I cared for her, respected her. But love?" He shook his head slowly. "I don't think either of us loved the other. Not really. We were two lonely people trying to make the best of a hard situation. There was affection, companionship, but not—" He looked at Maylene, his eyes intense. "Not what I have with you. What we have is different, deeper, more real." "How do you know?" "Because with Sarah, I always felt like I was going through the motions, doing what was expected, playing a role. With you, I'm just myself. And you let me be that, just like I let you be yourself. No pretending. No trying to be something we're not." The honesty in his words settled into her like warmth spreading through cold limbs. She understood what he meant because she felt it too, this sense of being fully seen and fully accepted, of not having to perform or pretend or hide the parts of herself she'd always been told were wrong. "I'm glad I'm not her," Maylene said softly. "I'm glad I get to be myself with you." "So am I." He stood and pulled her to her feet, brushing dirt from her skirt. "Come on, let's go inside before the mosquitoes eat us alive." That night, as they lay in bed with the window open to let in the cool, rain-washed air, Caleb reached for Maylene's hand and held it between both of his. "I want to tell you something," he said quietly. "What is it?" The day you arrived, when I first saw you step down from that stagecoach, you looked so scared, so small and frightened and ready to bolt. And I thought, well, he paused. I thought I'd made a terrible mistake. Not because of how you looked, but because I'd brought you to this hard place, this lonely life, and you clearly wanted to be anywhere else. I was terrified, Maylene admitted. I thought you'd take one look at me and send me back. Thought I'd crossed an ocean and half a continent just to be rejected again. I know. I could see it in every line of your body, hear it in your voice. And I wanted to tell you that you were safe, that I wouldn't hurt you, that you could trust me. But I didn't know how to say it in a way you'd believe. So you showed me instead. She thought of that first night. The warm water, the gentle washing of her feet, the quiet dignity he'd offered without words. You've been showing me ever since. And you've been showing me too. Showing me what it means to be brave, to choose hope, even when hope seems foolish. Showing me that I'm worthy of being loved, not just needed or tolerated, but actually loved. His voice roughened. You've given me more than you know, Maylene. She turned to face him in the darkness, her hand finding his cheek. We've given each other everything. That's what partnership means, isn't it? Not one person saving the other, but both of us making each other stronger. Yes, he agreed softly. That's exactly what it means. They made love then, slow and tender, and afterward lay tangled together listening to the night sounds, crickets singing, an owl calling, the soft rustle of wind through grass. And Maylene thought about how far she'd come, how much she'd changed, how the frightened bride who had arrived in winter had transformed into a woman who could imagine a future, who could hope, who could love without holding back. The next morning brought a visitor, Constance Hartley, arriving in her buggy with a basket over her arm and a purposeful expression on her round face. I hope I'm not intruding, she said as Maylene welcomed her inside. I brought some preserves and fresh bread, and I wanted to invite you to a quilting circle we're having next week. Several of the women have been asking about you. Asking about me? Maylene's stomach clenched with familiar anxiety. Yes. Constance set her basket on the table and began unpacking it. Jars of jam, a loaf of bread still warm from the oven, a small package wrapped in brown paper. After the fire at the Hutchinsons, after how you helped, well, people noticed. Mary's been telling everyone how kind you were, how you gave her hope when she had none. And at the barn dance, the way Caleb stood up to Susan Crawford, she smiled. You've made an impression. I'm not sure it's a good one. It's better than you think. Constance handed her the wrapped package. This is from Margaret Walsh. She wanted me to give it to you. Maylene unwrapped it slowly to find a beautiful linen handkerchief embroidered with delicate flowers in blue thread. It was clearly fine work, the kind of thing that took hours to create. She made this? For me? She wanted to apologize for being cold when you first arrived. She said she was wrong to judge you before getting to know you, and this is her way of saying she'd like to start over. The gesture was so unexpected, so generous, that Maylene's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to say. Say you'll come to the quilting circle. It's next Thursday at my house. Nothing formal, just women working together and talking. It would mean a lot if you'd join us. Maylene thought about it. The prospect of spending an afternoon with the women who had judged her, whispered about her, treated her as an outsider. Part of her wanted to refuse, to protect herself from the possibility of further rejection. But another part, the part that had grown stronger over these months with Caleb, wanted to try, wanted to reach out and see if connection was possible. I'll come, she said finally. Thank you for inviting me. Constance's smile was warm and genuine. I'm so glad. I think you'll enjoy it, and I think the other women will enjoy getting to know you too, once they give themselves the chance. After Constance left, Maylene stood in the kitchen holding the handkerchief, running her fingers over the careful stitches. It was such a small thing, but it felt monumental. A bridge extended, an olive branch offered, the possibility of belonging to something larger than just her and Caleb. When Caleb came in for lunch, she showed him the handkerchief and told him about the invitation. You should go, he said immediately. It'll be good for you, and good for them too. They need to see beyond their own narrow assumptions. What if they're cruel? What if I go and they make me feel small again? Then you come home to me and I'll remind you how extraordinary you are until you believe it again. He pulled her close. But I don't think they will be. I think they're finally starting to see what I saw from the beginning. And what's that? That you're strong and brave and kind. That you're worth knowing. That they're lucky to have you in their community, whether they realize it yet or not. His confidence bolstered her own, and when Thursday came, Maylin dressed carefully in one of her better dresses and rode into town with Caleb, who had business at the general store. He left her at Constance's house with a kiss and a promise to return in a few hours. The quilting circle was already in progress when Maylin arrived. 6 women gathered around a large frame with a partially completed quilt stretched across it. The conversation stopped when she entered, and Maylin felt the old familiar flutter of panic. Then Margaret Walsh stood, a welcoming smile on her face. "Mrs. Ridge, I'm so glad you could join us." She gestured to an empty chair. "Please sit here next to me. I understand you're skilled with embroidery. I'd love to see your technique." The warmth in her voice was genuine, and slowly the other women added their greetings. Dorothy Brennan asked about her garden. Susan Crawford, surprisingly, complimented her dress. Even women Maylin had never met before welcomed her with curiosity rather than hostility. As the afternoon wore on, Maylin found herself relaxing, her hands working steadily on the quilt while conversation flowed around her. They talked about gardens and children, about husbands and weather, about the small dramas and joys of frontier life. And gradually, they included her, asking her opinion, listening when she spoke, treating her not as an outsider, but as one of them. At one point, Mary Hutchinson arrived with her children in tow, her face lighting up when she saw Maylin. "Mrs. Ridge, I'm so glad you're here." She handed her youngest to Constance and came to stand beside Maylin's chair. "I wanted to thank you again for what you said to me the day of the fire. About rebuilding, about being stronger than we think. Those words have carried me through some very dark days." "I only told you the truth," Maylin said softly. "Yes, but sometimes the truth is exactly what we need to hear, especially when it's hard." Mary squeezed her shoulder. "You gave me hope. I won't forget that." After she moved away, Margaret leaned close to Maylin. "You made an impression on Mary, on all of us really. The way you helped during the fire, the way you've conducted yourself with such grace despite—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Despite not always being welcomed as you should have been. That takes strength." "I didn't feel strong," Maylin admitted. "I felt terrified most of the time." "That's what makes it strength." Margaret's eyes were kind. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it." The words echoed what Caleb had told her so many times, and hearing them from Margaret, from one of the women whose approval she'd craved and feared in equal measure, settled something inside her. When the afternoon ended and the women began gathering their things, Constance pulled Maylin aside. "You did wonderfully today. I hope you'll come to the next circle." "I will," Maylin said, and realized she meant it. "Thank you for including me. You're one of us now, whether you feel it yet or not. Give it time. These things don't happen overnight, but they do happen." The ride home with Caleb was quiet and peaceful, Maylin's mind full of the afternoon's revelations. When they reached the ranch, she saw that her garden had grown noticeably even in the few hours she'd been gone. The tomatoes heavier with fruit, the beans climbing higher, everything reaching toward the sun with determined optimism. "Good day?" Caleb asked as they walked toward the house. "Better than good." She slipped her hand into his. "I think I'm beginning to belong here. Really belong. Not just survive or endure, but actually be part of something." "I'm glad." He squeezed her hand. "Though you've always belonged, from the moment you decided to stay. The rest is just everyone else catching up." That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they sat together on the porch in comfortable silence. Maylin found her thoughts turning to the future Caleb had spoken of, the possibility of children, of expansion, of building something that would outlast them both. "Caleb," she said quietly, "what you said about children, about building a family." "Yes?" "I've been thinking about it, and I think—" She took a breath, let it out slowly. "I think I want that, someday. Not right away, but someday. I want to build that future with you." His arm tightened around her shoulders, and when she looked up at him, his eyes were bright with emotion. "You mean it?" "I mean it. I'm still scared. Probably always will be, at least a little. But I'm not going to let fear stop me from having the life I want. The life we want." "Maylene Ridge," he had said softly, his voice rough with feeling. "You are the bravest person I've ever known." "I'm not brave, I'm just—" She searched for the right words. "I'm just tired of being afraid. Tired of letting the past define my future. I want to choose hope instead." "Then that's what we'll do. Together." They sat watching the sunset deepen and fade, the sky turning from gold to rose to deep purple, and Maylene felt something inside her unfold, some last tight bud of fear opening into possibility. She had spent so much of her life believing she was unwanted, unworthy, destined for loneliness and shame. But here, in this wild place, with this quiet man beside her, she had found something she'd stopped believing existed. She had found home. As the stars began to emerge, Maylene turned to Caleb, her heart full of everything she'd been too afraid to feel for so long. "I need to tell you something," she said. "What's that?" "That night when you washed my feet, that first night when you showed me I was worth caring for, I didn't believe you. I thought it was pity or duty or just you being kind to someone pathetic. But now," she swallowed hard against the emotion rising in her throat, "now I understand. You weren't pitying me. You were seeing me, really seeing me, maybe for the first time in my life, and you chose to care for me anyway." "Not anyway," Caleb corrected gently, "because of who you are. There was never any anyway about it. I know that now. And I want you to know that I see you too. I see how hard you work, how much you care, how you show your love through actions because words don't come easily to you. I see your strength and your kindness and your quiet courage. And I choose you, Caleb Ridge. Every day for the rest of my life, I choose you." His eyes were suspiciously bright in the gathering darkness. "That's the most beautiful thing anyone's ever said to me." "Then I'll say it again. I choose you." He stood and pulled her to her feet, his hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. "And I choose you, Maylene. Today, tomorrow, always." Under the vast Wyoming sky, surrounded by mountains and starlight and the endless sweep of prairie, they kissed, a seal on promises spoken and unspoken, a commitment deeper than words, a love forged in quiet moments and gentle care, and the brave choice to hope when hope seemed foolish. When they finally pulled apart, Maylene felt lighter than she had in years, as if she'd set down a burden she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. The shame that had defined her for so long was gone, burned away by the steady warmth of Caleb's love and her own growing belief that she deserved it. In the weeks that followed, summer settled over the land with generous warmth. The garden exploded with abundance, more vegetables than they could eat, enough to preserve for winter and share with neighbors. Maylene spent long days canning and drying, her hands stained with berry juice and tomato pulp, her heart content with the simple satisfaction of providing, of preparing, of building security against the cold months to come. She attended every quilting circle, and with each gathering felt more integrated into the community. The women shared recipes and advice, traded stories and gossip, and gradually stopped treating her as the Chinese outsider and started treating her simply as Maylene, as one of them. She would never be fully the same as them, would always carry the mark of her heritage in her features and her accent and the way she moved through the world. But she was learning that being different didn't have to mean being less, that she could honor where she came from while still embracing where she was. One evening in late June, as Maylene was preparing dinner, she heard a commotion outside. Horses and voices, more activity than the ranch usually saw. She went to the door to find Caleb talking with Jim Hutchinson and two other men she didn't recognize, all of them dismounting and tying their horses to the fence. "Maylene," Caleb called, "can you put on extra coffee? We've got company." She did, and soon the kitchen was full of men talking business, something about a cattle drive coming through, about Caleb contracting to buy several head to start building a herd, about expansion and opportunity. She moved among them, serving coffee and the berry pie she'd made that morning, listening to their plans, their dreams, their vision for what the ranches in this territory could become. When they finally left, promises made and hands shaken, Caleb pulled Maylene into his arms. "This is it," he said, his voice alive with excitement she rarely heard from him. "The beginning of something bigger. With the cattle and the horses both, we could build something substantial, something that would last." "Something to pass on?" she asked quietly. "Yes." He pulled back to look at her, understanding in his eyes. Something to pass on. That night, they made love with new urgency, new purpose, and Maylene felt the shift between them from two people simply surviving together to two people actively building a future, creating something that would outlast them both. The days blurred together in the pleasant rhythm of summer work. Caleb preparing for the cattle, Maylene tending her garden and learning to ride Daisy with increasing confidence, both of them working side by side to prepare for the expansion that would change everything. On a morning in early July, Maylene woke feeling different, a subtle shift in her body, a new awareness. She lay still, hand on her stomach, waiting, and there it was again. Not quite nausea, but a queasy uncertainty, a sensitivity to smells that hadn't bothered her before. Hope and fear warred inside her. It was too soon to know for certain, too early to say anything, but she knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with proof and everything to do with instinct, that something had changed. She carried the knowledge quietly for weeks, waiting to be sure, watching her body for confirmation. When 2 months had passed with no monthly bleeding, when her breasts grew tender and her middle thickened ever so slightly, she could no longer deny it. She was pregnant. The realization terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. A child, a baby, a tiny life growing inside her that would need everything she'd never had. Love, acceptance, security, home. Could she give it? Could she be the mother this child deserved? She chose a quiet evening to tell Caleb when they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, as had become their custom. Her heart hammered as she reached for his hand. "Caleb, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" He turned to her, immediately attentive, concerned. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, better than fine. She took a breath, let it out. "I'm pregnant." For a long moment, he simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then his face transformed, wonder and joy and something like awe crossing his features in rapid succession. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor. But yes, I'm sure." "When?" "Early spring, I think. March, maybe April." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "A baby," he whispered into her hair. "We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" She needed to hear him say it, needed confirmation that this was wanted, that she wasn't about to repeat her own mother's struggle of raising a child no one valued. "Happy?" He pulled back to look at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Maylene, I'm beyond happy. I don't have words for what I am." "I'm scared," she confessed. "What if I'm not good enough? What if I can't?" "Stop." He cupped her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You're going to be an amazing mother. This child is going to be so loved, so cherished, so completely secure in their worth, because you know what it's like not to have that, and you'll make sure they never feel what you felt." Tears spilled over, and she let them fall. "I want that so much. Want to give them everything I never had. And you will. We will. Together." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "Thank you for choosing this, for choosing us, for being brave enough to hope." That night, lying in bed with Caleb's hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach, Maylene thought about the journey that had brought her here. The fear and shame and loneliness that had defined her life for so long seemed distant now, like stories told about someone else. She had been that frightened bride, that unwanted woman, that person who believed herself ugly and worthless. But she wasn't anymore. She was Maylin Ridge, beloved wife, trusted neighbor, soon-to-be mother. She was a woman who had chosen courage over fear, hope over despair, love over the safe numbness of not feeling. She was a woman who belonged to this man, to this land, to this life she was actively creating instead of passively enduring. The transformation hadn't been instant or easy. It had required daily choices, small acts of bravery, the willingness to trust when trust felt impossible. It had required Caleb's patient love and her own fierce determination, the support of women who had learned to see past their prejudices, and her own gradual acceptance that she deserved the life she was building. But she had done it. Against all odds and expectations, she had transformed from the woman who stepped off that stagecoach in winter, terrified and convinced of her own unworthiness, into someone who could imagine a future, who could carry a child with hope instead of fear, who could look at herself in the mirror and see not ugliness but strength, not shame but dignity. As summer deepened into early autumn and her pregnancy became visible, Maylene found herself welcomed into a new circle. The mothers of the community, who shared advice and stories and hand-me-down baby clothes with the same generosity they'd once withheld. Mary Hutchinson gave her a beautiful quilt she'd made, each square stitched with care. Margaret Walsh offered to help set up a nursery. Even Susan Crawford, who had been so cold at first, softened and shared the wisdom of her own 3 pregnancies. The community that had once held her at arm's length now embraced her, and Maylene understood that her acceptance hadn't come from changing who she was or hiding her differences. It had come from showing up, being present, offering help when it was needed, and allowing herself to be helped in return. It had come from the simple act of participating in the life of this place, instead of standing apart from it. On a golden October afternoon, with the aspens turning brilliant yellow against the darkening pines, and the air carrying the first hint of winter's approach, Caleb came to find Maylene in the garden. She was harvesting the last of the vegetables, her movement slower now, her belly round and prominent beneath her apron. "Come with me," he said, offering his hand. "I want to show you something." She let him lead her beyond the barn to a spot she'd never explored, a small rise that looked out over the ranch and the valley beyond. And there, staked out with string and marked with fresh-turned earth, was the foundation for a new house. "What's this?" she asked, though she already knew, could barely speak past the emotion choking her. "Our new home. Bigger, with real bedrooms and a proper kitchen, and a room just for the baby. I've been working on the plans for months, saving money, ordering lumber. Construction starts next week." He turned to her, his hands settling at her waist. "I want our child to be born into a home we built together, not just a cabin I made for someone else." "Caleb," she whispered, overwhelmed. "It's too much. We don't need—" "Yes, we do. We need space to grow, room for the life we're building. And I want—" He paused, seeming emotional himself. "I want you to help design it. Tell me where you want the kitchen, how big the bedrooms should be, what kind of windows you'd like. Make it ours, not just mine." The gesture was so perfectly him, practical and thoughtful, and deeply loving, showing his care through action rather than words. She threw her arms around him, or tried to, though her belly made it awkward, and he laughed and held her close. "Is that a yes?" "Yes. 1,000 times yes." They spent the afternoon walking the foundation, planning and dreaming, imagining the life they would live in this new house. And as the sun sank low and painted the sky in shades of fire, Caleb stopped walking and turned to her. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth and placed it in her palm. She unwrapped it carefully to find a simple gold ring, worn but beautiful, with a single small stone catching the fading light. "It was my mother's," Caleb said quietly. "The only thing of value she owned. I've been keeping it, waiting for the right moment to give it to you. And I think this is it, standing here, planning our future, carrying our child. I want you to have it. Want you to know that you're not just my wife in name or on paper. You're my partner, my love, my home." Maylene's hand shook as he slipped the ring onto her finger beside the simple band he'd given her at their hasty wedding. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her, as if it had been waiting all these years for her hand. "Thank you," she managed through her tears. "For this. For everything. For seeing me when I couldn't see myself. For waiting while I learned to trust. For loving me when I thought I was unlovable. You were never unlovable. You were just believing lies other people told you." He kissed her softly. "But you don't believe them anymore, do you?" She thought about it honestly. Did she still sometimes doubt? Yes. Did she sometimes hear her uncle's voice in her head calling her ugly, worthless, a burden? Yes. But did she believe those voices the way she once had, with absolute conviction? No, she said firmly. I don't believe them anymore. I believe you instead. I believe in us. As they walked back to the cabin together, hand in hand, Maylene felt the last pieces of her old life fall away like leaves from autumn trees, necessary loss to make way for new growth. The frightened bride who had arrived in winter was gone completely, transformed by love and time and the radical act of choosing to hope. In her place stood a woman who belonged to this land, to this man, to this life. A woman who was building something that would outlast her, creating a future instead of just enduring the present. A woman who had learned that strength wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it, that courage was waking up each day and deciding to try, to trust, to hope, even when hope seemed foolish. That evening, as they sat together on the porch one last time before the cold drove them inside for the season, Maylin placed Caleb's hand on her belly and waited. After a moment, the baby kicked, a flutter of movement, a reminder of the life growing between them. Caleb's face transformed with wonder. Was that? Yes, she smiled through her tears. That was our baby saying hello. He kept his hand there, feeling for more movement, his expression so full of awe and love that it took her breath away. And in that moment, Maylene understood something fundamental about herself, about life, about the journey she'd taken from Canton to San Francisco to this remote ranch at the edge of the world. She understood that belonging wasn't about being perfect or beautiful or what others expected. It was about being seen, truly seen, and choosing to stay anyway. It was about finding people who recognized your worth even when you couldn't recognize it yourself, and learning to believe them. It was about letting love in, even when love felt dangerous, even when vulnerability seemed like weakness. Most of all, it was about choosing yourself, choosing to live instead of just survive, choosing to hope instead of resign yourself to despair, choosing to reach for happiness even when happiness seemed impossible. As the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky and the first cold breath of winter whispered across the prairie, Maylene reached for Caleb's hand and held it tight. Not because she needed rescuing or saving or fixing, but because she wanted to, because choosing to hold his hand was choosing love, choosing partnership, choosing to face whatever came next together instead of alone. And in that simple gesture, that reaching out, that connection, that willingness to be vulnerable and open and present, she found what she'd been searching for all her life without knowing she was searching. She found herself. She found home. She found everything.